Hello and welcome to My Baseball History, presented by the Shoeless Joe Jackson Museum and Baseball Library in Greenville, South Carolina. I'm your host, Dan Wallach, and I'm the Executive Director of the museum. My Baseball History is a long-form interview podcast where each episode I'll talk to someone new who has some sort of association to the game of baseball. No matter who I talk to, we'll talk about how they fell in love with baseball, how their career started, and how they got to be where they are today. On today's episode, I spoke with Shawn Herne. Shawn has been the executive director of the Babe Ruth Birthplace Museum in Baltimore, Maryland since 2017. He has worked developing and administering museum exhibits and programs that are exciting and engaging, believing that the best visitor experiences come from museum elements that provoke thought and conversation. Before becoming executive director, Shawn had previously served as the chief curator of the Babe Ruth Birthplace Museum and Sports Legends Museum for over 12 years. Shawn has also served as executive director of the Hammond Harwood House in Annapolis, Maryland, worked as a curator for the B&O Railroad Museum in Baltimore, taught railroad history for the University of Baltimore, and published a book called The Railroad Timekeepers. He holds a Master of Arts degree in American History and Museum Studies from the University of Delaware, and a Bachelor of Arts degree in History and Political Science from Potsdam College. Shawn's role at the Babe Ruth Birthplace and Museum was previously only held by one person, Mike Gibbons. Mike retired in 2017 after 35 years as the Babe Ruth Birthplace Foundation's only executive director. When Shawn took over, he said this about Mike. He took a tiny shrine about a hometown boy turned baseball giant and manifested it into a leading sports heritage attraction. And that's true. In 1982, Mike volunteered to organize a makeover of the Babe Ruth Birthplace. It was a time when their annual attendance was roughly 2,000 visitors. By 1992, just 9 years after he was named executive director, he had increased annual attendance to 60,000 people. In addition, through the foundation, Gibbons raised $265,000 to create new exhibits on Babe Ruth and the Baltimore Orioles, as well as the 6 people from Maryland enshrined in Cooperstown. But don't think that just because he retired that he's out of the picture. Mike remains on the board at the Babe Ruth Birthplace Foundation as Director Emeritus and Historian, and oversees all curatorial, archival, and exhibit development projects. He was also at the museum the day Shawn showed me around, which was the day the museum was closed to the public. But that's the kind of people they each are. Hardworking, dedicated, and passionate. It's no wonder their museum is such an incredible place. In this episode, we covered lots of ground. Shawn tells us about some recently uncovered information which helps give us the real story about Babe Ruth's childhood. We find out how young the Babe was when he was already telling his friends he'd be the world's best pitcher. We learn about 2 people who helped Babe become the icon he eventually would become, both on and off the field. And we hear about a special phone call Shawn got after accepting his position at the museum. With all of that information and much, much more coming at you, it may be helpful to follow along with the episode's liner notes on our website. You'll still be able to enjoy the interview without the extra help, but sometimes when I'm listening to things like this, I like to really go in depth, so I've provided some photos and links to give you a better understanding of the things Shawn and I are discussing. Those liner notes can be found at the Shoeless Joe Jackson Museum website, which is online at www.shoelessjoejackson.org. If you want to follow along, head over to the museum's website and click on the podcast tab at the top. You can also head straight to shoelessjoejackson.org/shoelesspodcast and it will take you right to the page where you can click on the Shawn Herne episode or any past episode you might want to catch up on. Everything in the liner notes goes in chronological order of how we talked about them in the interview, so you should easily be able to keep your place as you listen. At the end of the episode, I'll explain how you can answer a trivia question on Twitter to win some prizes, so stick around until the end of the episode for that. The winner of our last episode's trivia contest was Eric Hatch, who is on Twitter @HatchEvent. After listening to the Marjorie Adams episode of My Baseball History, Eric knew that Doc Adams was the president of the Knickerbocker Baseball Club. Eric, shoot me a DM on Twitter @ShoelessPodcast with your mailing address, and I'll send you your prizes. But for now, here's my interview with Shawn Herne. Tell me a little bit about where you grew up.
So I grew up in northern New York, right at the point before you fall off the face of the earth, right on the Canadian border. So I'm from an Indian reservation called Akwesasne. It's the St. Regis Mohawk Indian Reservation. So half of it is located in New York State, a quarter of it is in Quebec, and another quarter is in Ontario. So What I tell everyone is if you drew a triangle from Montreal to Ottawa, the capital of Canada, to Lake Placid, where they held the 1980 Winter Olympics, I'm right in the center. So I'm not close to anything. It's about an hour and 15-minute drive to each one of those locations. But I grew up in the Adirondacks and grew up near the St. Lawrence River. So Maryland is my adopted home.
Were you a sports fan growing up?
A little bit. We did winter sports, so we followed more things like that. My family were football fans. Baseball was sort of secondary. And of course, in those days, I was an Expos fan.
Right.
I joke now that the last season of the Expos, I went up and went to a game, and I think it was the Expos were playing the Mets, and there was like 30,000 people there. And of course, we've been hearing all these stories that it was so bad. I'm like, what are they complaining about? They got 30,000 fans at Olympic Stadium, which was like the highlight of Soviet architecture. I mean, it was just this big concrete block, basically. And next morning, back at my parents' house, I saw on the news, 30,000 fans were at Olympic Stadium last night. Were they A, to see the Mets, B, to see the Expos, C, it was $1 hot dog night. And they're showing clips of all these people with stacks of hot dogs. And I'm like, I was wondering why the hot dogs were cheap. It was $1 hot dog night, and they got 30,000 people that night. So, I was glad to be there at the end of the last season. So when they moved to Washington, I still call them the Expos. The Expos fans never got over the 94 season. And so when Washington is in the World Series this year, I didn't dig out my Expos cap until the 8th inning of the last game. Like, we're not doing anything to jinx this. And all my friends from high school on Facebook were getting these little messages. All right, show us your gear. Who's doing it? Who's doing it? And we all had, all over the world now, people were putting Expos stuff on. So, so I guess I'm an Expos fan.
Yeah, that's awesome. So when was the first time that you remember becoming aware of Babe Ruth? And what's the first story or statistic that you distinctly remember hearing about from Babe Ruth?
Well, I wasn't a baseball guy. I wasn't a huge baseball fan. I was at the University of Delaware doing graduate work at the time in museum studies, and with my program, you had to do supervised field work. I'm 20-some years old. I'm arrogant. I think I know the world. And so when they were trying to find a location for me to do my field work, I said to the coordinator, just don't stick me into a historic house museum with blue-haired old ladies, because I don't want to do that.
So they were like, how do you feel about blue-haired old men?
Close. The director said, well, a friend of mine runs the B&O Railroad Museum in Baltimore. What do you think about that? And I was like, that would be great. So I spent the summer of 1996 at the B&O Railroad Museum. Well, Oriole Park was still new then. And I'd go back to Delaware, and everybody would be like, you're in Baltimore? Have you been to Camden Yards? Oh, my God, have you been to Camden Yards? You're in Baltimore? Have you been to... And I'm like, I have not been to Camden Yards. And then the B&O organized a volunteer appreciation night at Oriole Park. It was like $8, and it was your ticket, a hot dog, and a soda. And I'm like, I can afford $8, so I can go back and say, yes, I have been to Camden Yards. And I wasn't even going to go. I was just going to buy the ticket and say, yes, I've been. But I went and was completely mesmerized. It was like somebody put a spell on me as I walked through. I sat there completely in awe of the game, completely in awe of Oriole Park. And I went to 16 more games that season. It was just, the bug bit. And the next 2 seasons after that, it was pretty much the same. And just fell in love with the game. And I tell people that because unless you've experienced a game firsthand, especially in a historic type park, you understand the magic of it. And in Baltimore, they talk about Oriole magic. There's even a song that, Oriole magic, da-da-da, feel the magic, da-da. I'll not sing any more of it for you. But it was completely amazing. And I've called it sometimes lawn chess. I mean, you have to understand the nuance. Little things like the shift and understanding. At that time, we had a player on left field, B.J. Surhoff. And B.J. always looked like he was bored. He would stand there, and then he would bend over, he would grab a blade of grass and throw it up in the air and watch it. And at first I thought, wow, he's really bored. Only to realize later that he was judging.
A brilliant outfielder.
He was judging, where the wind was coming from and things like that. And learning those things along the way. So
we talk about baseball magic on this podcast a lot, and obviously with the Field of Dreams existing based primarily on Joe's story, a lot of those stories that are the baseball magic stories are about the Field of Dreams. And there's something about this sport. I mean, I love basketball. You don't get that in basketball. You know, you don't get football magic. But baseball, there's something about it that I don't know if it's because it's the oldest of the major sports or that it's, you know, so rooted in Americana or what it is, but there's something there.
It is classic. And what I love about baseball is I think it's better experienced outside. You don't need these monster stadiums. It is a classic game. The rules have changed so little compared to all the other leagues that seem to change their rules every single year or change their rules halfway through the season.
Right.
So there's very little of that. And, you know, this is the state of Maryland, so horse racing is a big deal here. And horse racing is pretty close to that, too. There's something classic. There's something historic about it. And baseball is such an important part of the history of this country and the history of all of our different peoples. One of the things that we like to talk about here at the Babe Ruth Museum is that sports is the one unifier that we still have. 100 years ago, the train station, whether it be in rural America or urban America, was the only place where all walks of life could come together. Different races, different economic backgrounds, genders, whatever. Our ballparks, our stadiums, our arenas are that place right now. It's the only truly egalitarian place that we have. Totally community-oriented, and I don't care if it's 9 innings or 4 quarters or 3 periods. You can develop a relationship with the person sitting next to you. Now, that relationship won't last after 3 periods or 4 quarters or 9 innings, but for that brief moment, time almost stops, and you have something that you share, commonality. And I don't think we appreciate the role that sports plays in our culture enough. Yes, recreation is important, but why am I still a University of Delaware fan 20-some years later? It's part of our culture. It becomes part of our identity, and I think it's a very important one.
And I think that's one of the things that people are overlooking about what we've lost this past year is that we didn't have those chances to go to stadiums and have those shared experiences with people. And yeah, you're watching it on TV maybe. Some people haven't, but even if you are watching the games, you're not experiencing it in the same way. You don't have that community involvement or relationship, and I think there's going to be long-lasting effects of this year just in those regards.
Oh yeah, psychologically, I think we're going to be studying this for a long time, and sociologically, we're going to be studying it. So in my community, I live in a new community of townhouses, and we have done driveway tailgate parties. So we're still doing the tailgate, which we would have done at the stadium for football, obviously not baseball. But for football games, we're doing a tailgate, and then at game time, everybody breaks up and goes back to their home. So we're still having some of that, and I think that's really important. For football, we hadn't figured that out with baseball, and that's why I think there's been such a disconnect this season, especially since if you're in a community where it's minor league, there was no baseball at all.
Right.
And Maryland has a lot of minor league teams, and a lot of the communities, it's not just, you know, what we lost economically with there not being games, but what did the community lose, and what did, you know, there are people who haven't left their houses.
Right.
You know,
it's devastating.
It is absolutely devastating. And, you know, I'm hoping that by opening day next season we have something figured out. Because it really does matter. It really does matter for us as a community, as a collection of communities. Maryland is a collection of communities, but as I said, you know, the one thing that brings us together is our sporting events.
So where are we right now? When I was growing up, I had always heard that Babe Ruth grew up at the St. Mary's Industrial School for Boys and never really considered that he must have lived someplace before that. So when did Babe actually live in the house that we're in right now?
Babe never lived here. He was born here. This was his grandparents' house.
Okay.
So this is his birthplace. So we never advertised it as his childhood home because he never stayed in one place for very long as a child until he got to St. Mary's. So this was his maternal grandparents' home. And when his mother is due to deliver, of course, the practice of that day was not to go to a hospital, but to have a midwife come in. And a midwife was known by everybody in the community, and if you were ready to have a baby, you knew who the midwife was that was going to deliver the baby. And in this case, it was Minnie Graff. And Minnie, you know, was a short German woman, and this was a German community, and she came in and delivered. So the baby was born here, but Babe sort of grew up early childhood in this neighborhood because all of his relatives lived here, His parents had different businesses in the neighborhood. They kind of moved around a lot, but moved from block to block. They weren't moving miles away.
Yeah.
So he's here probably very early childhood until he goes to St. Mary's.
Mm-hmm. And how did you get involved with the museum then? Because you started at the B&O Railroad Museum, and then we're very close to where that was. So how did you then become part of this museum?
Well, the museum industry is very interesting because it's very small and we tend to all know each other. And I've always find that interesting when someone's new to it and they haven't realized that yet. So I was working with a woman at the B&O Railroad Museum who left there to come here, and she became the development director. And at the time, we are a nonprofit museum, so we're managed by a board of directors. And the collections committee of our board, the committee that's responsible for the artifacts and exhibitions, had a representative on it who represented the museum industry. I used to joke that it's like the Dr. Seuss episode where they had that little creature, the Lorax, I think it was, who spoke for the trees. So I was asked to be the representative for the museum industry. So I spoke for the artifacts. I didn't speak for the museum. And they were getting ready to launch the construction of a new facility and asked me if I wanted to come on board. And at first I said, no way, I'm pretty happy overdoing what I'm doing. And then as they got a little farther along, it dawned on me just how exciting this project was going to be and what an opportunity it was. So I agreed to come over for 1 year, and that was 16 years ago.
Very cool. There are a lot of misconceptions about Babe Ruth's childhood and upbringing. Many of those were never squashed by the Babe himself, or they were flat out perpetuated by him. So I'd love to really be able to clear up some of those things today if we can. I'm sure we've all heard that Babe was roaming the streets of Baltimore by the time he was 6 or 7 or 8 years old, that he was committing crimes and smoking cigarettes and even drinking alcohol by that early ages. Some accounts say that Babe's parents owned a saloon, and since they were always running the business, that no one was around to supervise Babe. But some accounts say that he was just straight up an orphan. So what was really the home situation before he wound up at St. Mary's?
Well, he wasn't an orphan.
Right.
Okay, definitely not an orphan. And, keep in mind, this is Baltimore at the turn of the century. So he is a street kid. I mean, he's running the streets. His parents are running a business that's open till all hours of the night. So do I believe that he's out there getting into as much trouble as it is alleged? I don't. Do I believe he's skipping school? He's pretty young at this point to even be going to school.
Yeah, that's a good point.
But I think he's still out there getting into trouble. And there's an old saying that, don't let the truth get in the way of a good story. I think that's Babe Ruth. Babe told the best Babe Ruth stories, and not always factual. But the fact that he's been considered an orphan always is amazing to me, because the proof has been pretty clear right from the beginning that he was not an orphan.
Do you think that comes from the fact that St. Mary's housed orphans?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's somebody who's not done their research very well.
Yeah.
And so when I see modern articles that cite that kind of thing, it makes me think, you really didn't do your research, because the proof is pretty clear he was not an orphan.
Right.
And I don't believe he was a completely bad kid either. He hated that people thought he was a bad kid. I just think he was in a home situation that got to be very difficult. So we do know that his parents split up. They got a divorce. We know that the father got custody, not the mother, which was pretty unheard of in those times.
Right.
And so now you're George Sr., you're trying to run a saloon, and you have 2 kids that you're also trying to look after. And I think it just got to be too much. By that point, Babe's grandparents had passed away, so there wasn't an immediate family member to kind of step in. And I think that's where St. Mary's made sense.
Yeah. And St. Mary's would take in all sorts of kids from Baltimore, but Babe's dad actually paid room and board for him to stay there. So he wasn't brought in as like a ward of the state at that point, right?
Not at that point. So, yes, originally, George Sr. is having to pay for this.
Yeah.
And the best way I can probably describe it is tough love. When his parents divorce and George Sr. gets custody, he gets custody of 3 kids. And one is very, very ill. But he spent a fortune trying to save that child's life, which ultimately failed. Doctors, nurses were involved, a clinic where the child is sent to try to save him. But George Sr. is paying for this. He's not looking for generosity. So I think it's out of tough love that he sends him to St. Mary's. I think he also thinks that that's probably the kid's best shot of making it, because he would get a good education. Now, St. Mary's Industrial School, they'd kind of cut a deal where they became this place that the state would send orphans and delinquents and things like that, but they didn't start out that way.
I was always extremely familiar with the name Brother Matthias from St. Mary's. He was made out to be a cross between a father figure, a coach, a teacher, and the person who discovered that George Herman Ruth, the child, had the potential to become Babe Ruth, the baseball player. What do we know about him, who he was, and if he ever had that kind of relationship with anybody else?
I think he had that relationship with a lot of students there. And I think my understanding of the brothers, and this comes from people who also went to St. Mary's at different times, is that, they were stern and they were strict, but they were loving. They really did generally care about the kids. And with Babe, it was Brother Matthias and Brother Gilbert. Both of them kind of took him in.
Yeah.
But I think they did that with a lot of kids. And so many of the kids that went there spoke fondly of St. Mary's. They didn't speak of it as a detention center or a reform school or anything like that. They spoke fondly of their time there. So I think that was just the nature of the brothers that ran the school.
Yeah, Brother Matthias's name was really the only one from St. Mary's that I had heard when I was growing up reading books about Babe Ruth's childhood. But in doing more research, I did come across the name of Brother Gilbert, and specifically in Babe Ruth's own book of baseball from 1928, which he never mentions Brother Matthias at all. But he does mention Brother Gilbert multiple times. Who was that?
It's really hard to say because they were Zavarian brothers. There wasn't a lot known about them, and that was not their nature to put it out there. So I really can't tell you a lot about them.
Was Brother Matthias more like the elementary school guardian or teacher, and then Brother Gilbert was more like the high school aged?
No, I don't think it was as much that. I think Brother Gilbert was probably more of the academic side, and Brother Matthias was more of the sports side.
Interesting, okay.
But both were very important in shaping his character.
Yeah.
And there's a quote, and I'm not going to get it right, but Claire Ruth said that when Babe was 22, the world loved him, but when he was 12, only Brother Matthias loved him.
Wow.
It was something to that effect.
Yeah.
But Babe was he felt very strongly about both of them. He visited them, had relationships with them after his time there.
Right.
They had a pretty strong influence on who he was.
Absolutely. The superintendent of St. Mary's was Brother Paul Scanlon, who was technically Babe's legal guardian at a certain point. Was that how a place like that worked, where the superintendent was a legal guardian of all the children living on the premises, or was that a special case for Babe? And why was that the case for Babe?
Well, I don't think it was special for Babe. I think it was how the state had set up the relationship. So for the Zavarian brothers to assume custody, that changed the way the money was handled.
Gotcha.
So now money is coming from the state of Maryland, not coming from George Sr., which is why the custody had been transferred. But I don't think it was any special thing for George Jr. I just think it was the way it was set up at that time.
And was George Sr. a rich man?
Oh, no.
Right.
No.
So how was he able to afford room and board and the medical bills for the other child? What was his financial situation
He owned
like?
a business, but he always rented the building that he was in. And I think he was hardworking. Probably not a warm and fuzzy guy, but there are accounts that when Babe starts playing baseball that he does go to games to see him play baseball. He actually ventured on one time all the way down to Washington to see him play against the Senators. But, I think he's just a hardworking guy. I think also, though, it comes to a point where he can't afford to do it. And I think that's when Babe leaves St. Mary's for the first time. When he goes back, I think the deal had been cut where now he's a ward of the state.
Gotcha. So Jack Dunn was the owner of the Baltimore Orioles of the International League. He was also friends with Brother Gilbert. Do you think that's how it came to be that Babe signed a contract with that team? Was through that connection, or because they're a local team and they just knew that, hey, this local kid is hitting home runs out of the ball fields that they're playing at?
Well, I think it's both. Because as the kids got older, they did start playing ball games outside of St. Mary's. So most of the younger kids, they have their own little league within the school, and they're not going out and playing other locations. But as they get to the high school age, they're traveling, and sometimes they're playing some of the smaller local colleges, especially in the Catholic system. But George Jr. was starting to make a name for himself locally before Jack Dunn gets involved. So Jack Dunn is a pretty smart and shrewd businessman and manager. So he's kind of always got his ear out for new talent, and I think he probably reached out to Brother Gilbert rather than the other way around.
Yeah.
But said, I'm hearing stories about this kid, I want to come see him. And of course, once he sees him, he immediately wants to sign him.
Right.
So,
yeah.
But Jack Dunn, the Dunn family is still involved with the Orioles, but the International League Orioles, they won 7 pennants in a row, which is still a record. Back in the 1920s. He had created a pretty significant dynasty here with the Orioles, and had Baltimore been a major league town, who knows what he could have done. We'd had to wait, another 20 to 30 years before the St. Louis Browns moved to town to show us what could be done.
Right, and that's a major what if, is if it were a major league town, would Babe Ruth have signed with the Baltimore team instead of somewhere else?
Right, hard to say. At that point, his contract was sold, and he didn't really have any negotiating power.
Right.
Which is, as you know, more typical of what was happening in those days. We didn't have a minor league system.
Right.
And so different teams would buy the contracts from some smaller league.
Mm-hmm.
Connie Mack, built his entire empire doing that.
Right.
And oftentimes picking people out of Baltimore. So they had different relationships with different clubs.
Yeah.
And, Jack Dunn needed money. And now he had this phenomenal kid, and he had to make the choice.
Right.
And thank God he did. One of the things that we point out here in Baltimore all the time is that the Baltimore Orioles discovered Babe Ruth. And, everyone tends to think of Babe as either, of course, as a Yankee or a Red Sox, but no one remembers that he was an Oriole first. And that's a reason why there's a statue of Babe Ruth at the entrance of Oriole Park at Camden Yards.
Right.
We're not doing it for Yankee fans when they come to visit.
The Baltimore Sun reported the signing of that contract on February 15th, 1914. It said that Babe's salary was going to be $600 for the season. What can you tell us about not only his stats while he was with the Orioles, but what life was like for Babe during those few months that he played with the team? Was he just absolutely dominant, and that's why the Red Sox came to come get him? Or was he a kid playing professional baseball for the first time and still trying to figure things out?
Oh, I think it was a little bit of both. I mean, he was certainly phenomenal on the field.
Mm-hmm.
And keep in mind, he was a pitcher.
Right.
So he's getting the numbers in, but he's not getting the numbers in every day as if he was an everyday player. I think he is incredibly naive. He's come out of St. Mary's with no experience on life. And we actually play an audio here in the museum of him telling the story about riding the train for the first time. And he's in a sleeping berth, and they have this little pocket that's up above the berth, and that's where you're supposed to put your wallet and stuff like that. And one of his teammates said, "Don't you know anything? That's where your arm goes." So he tried to ride the entire train with his arm up in this little pocket. And by the time they get to North Carolina, he can't lift his arm anymore. And he just was naive. And first time he's in an elevator, he spends all day going up and down in the elevator. He nearly kills himself on a bicycle because he had never ridden a bicycle before. Mm-hmm. So the world was completely new to him. And without direct supervision, even though Jack Dunn had signed custody papers, he's not watching him.
Right.
This kid is just out there running amok. But when he's on the ball field, he's pretty focused. And I think that stays with Babe through his career. Mm-hmm. Of all the stories of the excesses, which I don't believe, by the way, nobody can play on the level that he played on consistently and do all the things that are alleged that he did.
Mickey Mantle did it.
Well...
Every generation, there's somebody who is just superhuman, and Babe Ruth seemed to be that person for that generation.
I think that's partially true, but I also think that, as I said earlier, don't let the truth get in the way of a good story.
Of course.
And Babe loved good stories.
Yeah.
And he certainly would embellish them if he could.
Right.
So I don't think he does half the things that are attributed to him.
Like Yogi Berra said, I never said half the things I said.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. I don't think he can perform on the ball field every day consistently the way he did, mm-hmm. and be hungover. I don't believe the story that he ate 18 hot dogs. I just don't. Mm-hmm. But, I wasn't there, so
right.
So who knows?
So the legend continues.
That's right.
On July 11th of 1914, so he signed his contract with the Baltimore Orioles February 15th. On July 11th, Babe made his Major League debut with the Red Sox and would never play in the minor leagues again.
Actually, that's not true at all.
Oh.
Boston immediately sends him down to Providence.
Oh.
So he finishes out the season in Providence. So, he doesn't come back up with the Red Sox right away.
So how did Babe go from the Baltimore Orioles to the Boston Red Sox in the first place? Was that Jack Dunn making calls because he knew he needed money, or was it Boston Red Sox sending scouts down saying, we're looking for a pitcher or whoever, and they just saw a kid who had potential?
I honestly don't know the answer which way it went. That's
mm-hmm.
a great question. I'm surprised I don't have an answer for that.
1914 as a whole was a whirlwind of a year for Babe. He signed his first professional contract. He gets picked up by Boston. He makes his Major League debut. He meets a waitress at a luncheonette around the corner from the hotel room he was renting in Boston. And 3 months later, on October 17th, 1914, they got married. So Babe was 19 at the time, and his new wife, Helen Woodford, was 16. Was Babe trying to settle down at 19 years old? Like, was he trying to prove to himself that he could be the husband that his father never was? Or what was going on there?
I think there's a little bit of that. I think he just fell head over heels in love. And again, he's not had much experience of any kind, so I'm not even sure how the dating went. Now, they came to Maryland to get married. They were married in Ellicott City, because Ellicott City, Maryland, along with Elkton, Maryland, were the only two places where you could get married underage without parental consent. And she was 16 years old. So they got married in Ellicott City. And it's ironic because the church in Ellicott City has a little tiny shrine display in the back of the church dedicated to Babe Ruth and that moment. But they stay here in Baltimore that off season. They live here with his father, which was probably good because it already seemed like he was a little bit out of control at that point. It doesn't seem like anyone is guiding or directing Babe at this time. It seems like he's figuring it all out on his own. There was nobody telling him, Babe, you've never really dated girls before. You shouldn't marry the first one you come to. But he did. And I don't know if there was just no one there to tell him or if he wasn't listening. Maybe there were some people. But the people surrounding him are ball players.
Right.
And he's
telling him to keep his arm at the top of the train because that's where you keep it. Yeah.
And he's a kid.
Right.
He's a kid. We tend to look at all of our athletes through a different lens. But, here's a kid who leaves St. Mary's. He's 19 years old and on his way. And he's not even 20 yet when he's with the Red Sox and he's doing all this stuff. So,
right.
I think if today one of us would kind of try to pull him aside and say, okay, slow down there, boy.
Right.
But I don't think there was anybody around doing that.
And even when there were people later in life that were looking out for his best interests, living in moderation in any regard didn't seem to be one of his strong suits.
No, he didn't like to be told.
Right.
How different is that than any other 19-year-old male? He was pretty headstrong. He had pretty much determined what he wanted to do. But, the only one that ever came close to that, and I think the only one was Brother Matthias. I think that was the only one that could get his attention and kind of talk to him. His father couldn't do it. Certainly his managers couldn't do it, and there wasn't, I think, a manager in any of the clubs that he was affiliated that he liked all that much.
Right.
Because, you've got your way of doing things, and somebody's telling you to do it differently, and you don't want to hear that.
It's been interesting to hear you mention the different points of his life after he left St. Mary's that he reconnected with his father. There's the famous story that nobody ever came to come visit Babe when he was at St. Mary's. Is that true? And if it is, why did that not happen?
Well, again, it's the lens that we look at things. And so when we're talking about the St. Mary's Industrial School, if you look at the 1912 census, I think it is, the students at St. Mary's are listed as inmates. Okay? And the policies at the time was that if you were going to visit someone at St. Mary's, you got to spend 30 minutes with your child in the cafeteria. They sat you in the cafeteria, and then they brought your child to you. You got to do that once a month. So you got 30 minutes once a month to visit your child. So when he says nobody came to visit me, that's probably true. Dad's running a business, and his mother at this point is out of the picture, and then she dies. So there's probably not a lot of people going to visit him. So, is that part of the story true? Yes, but that was also the circumstances and how it was set up. There were no kids that were getting visitors every week.
What was the reason why Babe's parents got divorced? How did that all come to be?
Well, this is a delicate story to tell. So Babe's mother had an alcohol problem, and we've discovered this in recent years. And the story about Babe Ruth's early childhood has always had gaps in it, pretty significant missing pieces. And somebody was doing some research about 4 or 5 years ago, and he was doing genealogy research, and it was on a computer, and he was just having fun because all this stuff was new, and he was putting now names in, and he put in George Ruth. And all this stuff came up that he was fascinated by, and he contacted us and brought us what he had found. And what had happened was that Babe's mother was a severe alcoholic, and she was doing some things in order to obtain alcohol. And George Sr. has her arrested and the bartender whom she was doing things with was also arrested, which he could do, what he needed to do in order to get a divorce. And so in the testimonies, she acknowledges that she was basically having an affair for alcohol. And I would say that's probably the most polite way of saying it.
Yeah.
And so George Sr. files for divorce. He puts in the Baltimore Sun that I, George Ruth, am no longer responsible for any expenses or debts incurred by Christine Schomburger Ruth.
Wow.
Which he had to do. And then she doesn't show up for the divorce hearing, and then she doesn't show up for the custody hearing. And so George Sr. gets custody.
Was Babe at the custody hearing?
No.
Okay.
No. And so anyway, George Sr. gets custody, which was one of those things that always kind of made us scratch our heads a little bit. How did the father get custody? Because that's unheard of.
And a saloon owner, like that's
exactly.
Not only are you the father, but you have this kind of, not seedy business, but a business that is looked down upon by a lot of people. That not a great environment for a child to be.
Yes, well, he's not running a 4 or 5 star establishment either. He's running a bar next to the railroad tracks, so it is a little seedy. His clientele is seedy, so that is a fair point. But yeah, he ends up getting custody, and mom dies shortly after from tuberculosis. So he never had that normal home life. He never had that normal home experience. Whether or not he credited his father for doing the best that he could, I don't know. But they were able to have a relationship with each other later on.
Yeah, that's interesting. I had never really known that.
Well, none of us did. And even us here at the Babe Ruth Museum, we'd kind of sit there and go, why is Babe's father buried in West Baltimore and Babe's mother buried without a headstone in East Baltimore? We only got a headstone for her about 10 years ago.
Wow.
Because she was buried in an unmarked... they knew where she was, but it wasn't marked when you walked around in East Baltimore. We're like, why they weren't buried together? Well, that's because they weren't married to each other. The divorce and all of that part of the story was something that Babe had just always left out. But it now makes sense why he didn't divorce his first wife, even after that marriage fails. He never divorces her, refuses to divorce, and continued to support her.
Yeah. Although Babe was incredibly hurt that no one ever came to visit him while he was there, and he must have had some very lonely days and lonely nights there, it seemed like he really appreciated his time at St. Mary's, and you've kind of alluded to that he had these relationships continuing on with the brothers afterwards. To that point, 5 years after he left, a fire destroyed most of the buildings at St. Mary's, including the main school building, and Babe was on the Yankees at that point and decided to sponsor a tour by the St. Mary's Industrial School Band, which was a band that John Philip Sousa said was the best high school band he had ever seen play. During the last Yankees road trip of 1920, the band traveled with the team known as Babe Ruth's Boys Band, and they would give concerts before the game started and then collect money from the crowd while the game was going on. So with Babe's help, the school was rebuilt and continued to serve wayward boys of Baltimore for another 30 years. And this is just one example of the Babe being incredibly charitable. Where did Babe get that sense of charity? How did that become part of his personality?
I think because Babe didn't have a normal childhood, he felt a real bond to kids. At St. Mary's, he kind of was the big brother to a lot of the little kids and protector of some of the little kids. But I think that he missed out on his childhood, and so he had a special place in his heart for children. And he had that for the rest of his life. And we know later that Christy Walsh orchestrates visits to orphanages and hospitals and things like that. Babe was doing that anyway. He just wasn't doing it with reporters. Christy Walsh organizes it, so now there's photographers and reporters when he's doing it. But Babe was doing it anyway because I think he always had a special place in his heart for kids. And he had a special place in his heart for St. Mary's. And we know later that a lot of the money that was raised on that tour with the band came from Babe's own pocket. So Babe is very interesting. He spends a lot of money. He gives a lot of money away. There's a story that he wrecks a car, and instead of getting the car fixed, he just says, "Send me another one." He has no sense of savings of money.
Yeah.
And again, I think that he's naive about the world in that regard.
Well, and he was bringing so much money in. So
right.
You don't think when you're 24 years old and making $70,000 a year when the average person's making $2,000, you don't think that that's ever going to end or that you can possibly blow through it all.
Right. Which is what we see today with a lot of athletes.
Right.
And that they suddenly have a lot of money in their pocket and they're going through it as fast as they're making it.
And they don't realize that their career is going to be 6 years and not 60
Right.
years.
Right, exactly. I think that was the beauty of Claire Ruth, and I think that was the beauty of Christy Walsh. I mean, there are, again, stories with, Babe is incensed because he's doing some of these advertising things, and he's the first athlete to lend his name and likeness, for product advertisement. I mean, we have Babe Ruth underwear here at the museum in the original box. He was willing to put his name and face on just about anything, but Christy Walsh is negotiating contracts where some of that money is going into like an annuity that Babe can't get his hands on, and he's furious with Walsh that he can't get his hands on some of that money. But then later on in life, that's the money he has to live on.
Right.
And Claire Ruth is the same way. Claire Ruth turns out to be the best thing that ever happened to him because, she is his wife, but she's also his manager, and she's the stabilizing piece of his life, from the late 20s onward. I think all of the stories of excesses about Babe when he's young, those have more potential for truth than anything later on, because once Claire enters the picture, he's a different man.
Yeah. You mentioned something that so many people are aware of the Babe going to hospitals and promising home runs to sick kids and things like that. But I've also seen pictures of Babe playing ball in the streets and in sandlots with kids. There's also the story of the September 4th, 1923 exhibition game in Philadelphia after the Yankees had a day game against the Athletics that day, where Babe played in a game just before the sun went down to raise money for a baseball field for Ascension of Our Lord, a Catholic church in Philadelphia. So was Babe always so willing to go out of his way for children because he wished that he had been treated that way as a child? Or a lot of those things calculated photo ops that Christy Walsh was not pressuring him to do, but just saying, hey, this would be great for your image and great things for you to do? What was that?
I think he did it because he wanted to. We have hundreds of photographs of Babe Ruth here at the museum, and the photographs of Babe with kids are completely different. There's a smile on his face that you can't fake. Many of the other photographs, Babe had a smile that was intended for the cameras. He knew the power of a photograph. He knew that a reporter needed a quote. He made sure they got them. But when he's around kids, it's very different. And we have photographs of him with kids where you can tell it wasn't even a planned photo, but he's having a great time. And I just think that's who he was. He was a kid at heart himself, and he adored kids. And it's important to note that he adored all kids. And there was a story once where he was visiting, and it might have been Cleveland, but he's visiting a hospital and an orphanage, and they're both white. And somebody reaches out to him and said, you can't visit the kids at our black orphanage? And so he's just skipped lunch that day and went over there and did it. And again, there were no cameras, there was no publicity, he just did it. And we have a lot of photographs of him with kids, and it's kids from all walks of life. And I just think that's who he was. He saw people differently than most people of his era. And he thought baseball was the greatest thing, and kids playing baseball was the greatest thing.
Yeah. Well, look what it led to for him. It gave him a life that he probably never thought he could have ever had.
Well, and Babe Ruth is the ultimate American dream story. He is the grandson of German immigrants. He goes to essentially what is a reform school. He's taken off the streets of a rough town and rises to be the greatest ball player of all times. And so, he's an amazing success story. He's also the epitome of the roaring 20s. He is living life to the fullest in the 20s. But those same kids are now young adults during the Depression.
Right.
And so he now offers hope and the idea that you can still make it, that a kid from the street can be successful. And over the years, I've talked to so many people who, are now in their 90s, many of them are not with us anymore, who can still recall their interaction with Babe Ruth or meeting him or getting him to sign something. And these are men and women who are in their 90s who are telling stories that they remember vividly from when they were 7 and 8. Right. I don't remember many things from when I was 7 and 8, but these people remembered vividly. He was that kind of inspiration for people.
Yeah.
And that's why I think barnstorming became so important, because, it was the only way people in the rest of the country could actually see what this guy was like and who he was. And I think he was special. Now, I'm biased, of course. I'm here at the Babe Ruth Museum.
I think you might be onto something, though.
But I think he's truly special, and we see it from time to time. Every generation has somebody who's pretty extraordinary. And I think Babe was the extraordinary guy from his time.
Yeah. He definitely had a wild side to him, though. In fact, he had a few different brushes with death thanks to his, let's say, promiscuity. One time, a woman chased him through a crowded train with a knife because he had cheated on her. Another time, a man with a gun chased Ruth out of a hotel room in Detroit while Babe was still naked after he had slept with the man's wife. And in 1925, he missed part of the season with, quote, the bellyache heard round the world, which was most likely a combination of poor diet and a ton of syphilis. Was he really as wild as the stories say, or were things based in truth then exaggerated to make the tall tales that we know today?
Well, the ton of syphilis is interesting because I don't think there's still any proof that, there are certainly doctors who say, it kind of looked that way. But there's no medical report that said this is what he had.
But like you said, with Christy Walsh controlling the media, if any newspaper had said this is what was happening, they would have known that's the last time you'll ever have Babe Ruth in your newspaper.
Right, and it was also a different time. I mean, there were certainly things that the media knew was going on that they didn't share, and his teammates knew were going on that he didn't share. And, and I come back to, that was the beauty of Claire Ruth. She becomes his domestic manager, is the best way to describe it. She learns how to manage him. She knows his reputation. Again, I don't believe all of those stories, but I wasn't there, and there's certainly a good argument that a bunch of them did happen. But, wow, it's awkward to comment on a part of someone's life that you're like, well, do you say good for you, or do you say what were you thinking?
Right.
And that's where it's interesting, because he is such a dichotomy all the time that, he has a very strict Catholic upbringing. And then all of these things he's doing on the other side are certainly not, reflective of that strict upbringing that he had. But then his faith is such an important part of who he is, and he doesn't broadcast it. But we know through different moments in his life that, he had been born Lutheran, but he'd become Catholic at St. Mary's, and his Catholicism was an extremely important part of his life. Yet his actions don't necessarily reflect those values.
I think it's kind of a case of, and we've heard this from many people throughout history who have had parents who died young, or siblings who died young, or if the people close to you don't live long, you think, I'm going to live my life to the fullest, because if I'm not around when I'm 60 years old, it doesn't make sense to live in moderation. So I'm 25 right now. I'm making more money than anybody in the world. I'm going to go out and have some fun. Was that to his detriment and to the detriment of his health later in life? Probably. But here we are 100 years later still talking about these incredible stories that may or may not have happened, but I think that's part of it.
Absolutely. And I thought about this earlier today, and Babe Ruth's mother, I'm sure she had no idea when she's trying to get her hands on alcohol that 100 and some years from now that people would be talking about it.
Right.
And that it would be, it was in the newspaper once, but 100 years later it's going to be in books.
Right.
I mean, think about that there's
those actions changed American history.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And might that change your judgment a little bit? Maybe.
Right.
I think Babe is, I don't want to say he's out of control, but he's certainly experiencing life to the fullest.
Yeah.
I think in the early part of the 20s it does get out of control. There is an episode where, he's in a public setting and he kind of is chastised that he's let the kids down. And that is when he kind of promises to clean up his act, and he does. He kind of slows down a little bit, settles down a little bit, and never allows his out-of-control nature to completely take over. And again, once Claire Ruth comes in, I mean, you don't hear these stories about the excesses in the 1930s and on.
Yeah.
And there is something to be said for age and maturity. But Claire also knows who he is. She knows his reputation. She was part of that reputation.
Right.
And she doesn't really let him out of her sight much. So I think it's 50-50.
So let's go back before Claire and talk about something that happened on September 22nd, 1922. Babe and his wife Helen at the time revealed that they had a 16-month-old baby named Dorothy. Not even Babe's closest friends or teammates had any inkling that he was a father, and it was a huge shock to everyone, especially the press, when Helen and Dorothy showed up at the Polo Grounds that day. Answering questions from reporters, Helen denied that the baby had been adopted. So who was Dorothy, and how did she really come to be part of Babe's life?
Well, that continues to be a mystery to this day. So Babe always acknowledged that he had 2 adopted daughters. There have been times that he contradicted that. There were times when Dorothy, later in life, contradicted that. And we really don't know. We really don't know exactly what happened. Mm-hmm. All I can say is what I've heard from both sides of the family is that Babe had 2 daughters that he loved very much. They were adopted daughters who we know who Julia's father was, because Claire had been married previously and was widowed. But with Helen, we don't know. And there's always been rumors. But there's never been a substantial amount of evidence put forward one way or the other. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. That's a tough one.
Yep.
That's a tough one.
That's okay. Babe's relationship with Helen fizzled, and at a certain point, they would barely see each other and were living in different houses. Helen lived with another man, and everyone thought that they were married. So what happened with that relationship? How did they meet each other, and why did Helen and Babe separate the way that they did?
Babe and Helen's relationship had deteriorated pretty quickly, and he was not going to be the stay-at-home husband, I think, that she was thinking he was going to be. He just continued on with, his antics, which eventually causes her to have a nervous breakdown. Now, he stays in her life, but they do not live together. I do not know how she met the dentist that she was living with when she died. Mm-hmm. And in fact, the town that she lived in didn't know. They just assumed that she and the dentist were husband and wife.
Right.
It's only discovered she dies in a fire that, in fact, it was Mrs. Babe Ruth who had passed away.
Yeah.
So that's another piece of the story that we don't have. And I don't know if it was that Babe didn't want us to have it, but I've not seen anything that recorded exactly how that happened.
Interesting.
And again, looking through that lens that I keep talking about, a lens of the 1920s, there are some things you talk about and some things that you don't talk about.
Right.
There are things that we would talk about today certainly would not have been talked about then. And it would be the nature of most people just to accept what explanation was given. Mm-hmm. And I think that might have been the case here. Now, whether or not Dorothy actually was Babe's child through there was a woman, I think her name is Juanita.
Right.
I don't know. I don't know if it was something that people would whisper about privately, but they wouldn't talk about it publicly. Mm-hmm. It was just not considered normal in the time, and it certainly would not have been tabloid news the way we have tabloids today.
Yeah. In 1923 is when Babe met Claire Hodgson, who was the daughter of an attorney from Georgia. Claire had a daughter from a previous marriage in Georgia, but they moved to New York after Claire's husband died, and she launched a career as a model and a Broadway chorus line performer. Babe really did seem to love Claire's daughter, Julia, who was most likely the reason why his relationship with Lou Gehrig crumbled, actually. Because Babe used to have dinner with Lou at Lou's mom's house, and one night Lou's mom made the comment that Babe treated Julia better than he treated his own daughter, and Babe took offense to that, even though it was probably a little true, and things were never really the same between he and Lou. So after that comment, did Babe make any concerted efforts to be better to Dorothy?
Well, we're missing a piece here.
Okay.
So that's not quite what happened.
Fill me in.
So it was actually Dorothy, and it was directed at Claire Ruth.
Oh.
That, isn't it sad that she doesn't... So Dorothy was the younger of the 2 daughters, even though she was from the first marriage. I mean, she was a bit of a tomboy. So the comment was sort of made offhanded that, isn't it sad that Claire dresses her own daughter far better than she dresses the other daughter? And Claire took offense to that.
Interesting.
So that's sort of how the feud began, was that it was between the wives of the ball players. Now, we've also heard from different players over the time that the feud between Babe and Lou Gehrig was only public to save face with their wives, that they still had some of a relationship, but they knew better than to tell anyone that they still had a relationship with each other. I'm sure it certainly was strained. And they do make up later on, and in fact, the wives make up first.
Right.
And it's very odd that later on in life, you see Lou's widow and Claire Ruth out in public events together. They eventually forgave and forgot, but I've heard it alleged that the feud between the Babe and Lou Gehrig was nowhere near as bad as it was made out to be, and that was to save face with their wives.
Good, because that always bothered me, that they were these great teammates, and there's so many pictures. You see the one of Babe playing a saxophone, and Lou's got his ears plugged, and it seemed like they had fun together and they enjoyed each other's company, and they were like the yin and the yang. They complemented each other's personalities and lifestyles, and to know that at a certain point that all ended, for somebody like Babe who didn't have people who were close to him, it must have been a heartbreaking thing to lose somebody who you finally found a friend.
Well, it's hard to say if Babe really had any close friends. And I think Babe kind of drug Lou along on some of these things. And you certainly see it when they had the barnstorming team, the Bustin' Babes and the Larapin Lou's. I don't think that Lou Gehrig was ever comfortable in that kind of limelight and that kind of show. I think he liked to play baseball, and that's what he wanted to do, but he kind of got drug along sometimes.
Yeah.
So I think their personalities were so vastly different from each other, but they found something in each other that they could respect.
Yeah.
And one of those little known stories is that Lou Gehrig spoke German, and often he'd be interviewed at the clubhouse in German, and Babe would turn around and answer because Babe also spoke German. And we forget that he's the grandchildren of German immigrants, both families. There was probably German being spoken. Babe spoke German.
Yeah.
Nobody really knew that, except in these rare occasions when he would answer a question in German. And that always comes back to me is that the image of Babe Ruth is very different than who Babe Ruth really was, who the person was. He was always portrayed as this completely happy-go-lucky, irresponsible, almost buffoon-like person. But I also think he was a lot smarter, he was a lot deeper, he was more sensitive than people ever give him credit for. And as I said, he understood public relations before we even called it that. He understood appearances, but he felt passionate about the things that he did, otherwise he wouldn't do it. He loved when everybody laughed, and he loved to have a good time, and you saw that not just with partying, but with vaudeville, and he was more than happy to be the butt of the joke. He was more than happy to be the clown if that made people happy. And I don't think that comes from a simpleton. I think that comes from somebody who is a lot more comfortable with who they are, a lot more confident than most, and is a smart guy.
Yeah. Babe made his Major League debut at the age of 19 and was a legitimately great pitcher. Many people speculate that he would have made the Hall of Fame strictly as a pitcher, even if he never swung a bat. He had a lifetime record of 94-46 and an ERA of 2.2770, which is the 17th best ERA in the history of baseball. And of the 16 people ahead of him, 5 of those pitchers had some point of their career before the year 1900. So it was just really a different game back then. Babe won more than 20 games in a season twice, and he led the league in ERA at the age of 21, then led the league with 35 complete games at the age of 22. So just an incredible pitcher from a very young age. He pitched in both the 1916 and 1918 World Series, going 3-0 with a .87 ERA. He threw 13 shutout innings against the Dodgers in 1916 World Series, and then another 16 straight shutout innings against the Cubs in the 1918 series. So his record of 29 consecutive postseason shutout innings stood for more than 40 years. Are you more awestruck by what he actually accomplished at the plate in his career, or more curious about what he could have accomplished on the mound if he played the rest of his career out as a pitcher?
Well, first of all, I'm impressed in what he did on the mound, period.
Yeah.
I mean, you look at those numbers. 94-46 career, 2.28 ERA career. Not one season, career.
Right.
These are phenomenal numbers, and his daughter Julia once told me that he was the most proud of his pitching records, as he should be. He just wanted to play every day. He loved the attention, and he knew he was special. But his pitching record is extraordinary. So yeah, it could have been what if, but we could play what if all the time. He could have thrown out his elbow, and it would have all been over the next season. The Red Sox certainly questioned whether or not this type of record was going to continue, and that was partially behind their idea of the sale. So, hindsight is wonderful, but for me, and it always comes back down to pitching, Those kind of numbers are extraordinary. And you mentioned his earned run average is 17th on the all-time roster. That's from the 1880s to last October. Absolutely exceptional. And here at the museum, we talk about the Ruthian record because people always say, well, what about so-and-so? And, well, this one went after this record. Babe set 206 records during his career. Now, oftentimes he broke the record himself, but 206 records in all categories. And we see different players assaulting one of those records.
And it's a huge deal.
It's a huge deal.
Right.
And a couple of years ago, Shohei Ohtani coming up from Japan, going over to the Angels, it was the first time the family, anyway, acknowledged this guy has got the best shot because he was the full package. He was doing both. And we did a lot of interviews with the Japanese media. The difference was that his personality couldn't have been more opposite of Babe Ruth.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Ohtani would go back to a dormitory after a game and call it a night, whereas Babe would be out on the town tearing the place apart. So, you know, in that regard, but he was the first one to come along, really, that showed the most potential to go after the records.
One of our listeners on Twitter, Paul Baskowski, asked, obviously Babe's bat had to be in the lineup every day, but did he want to be in the pitching rotation for his turn and then play in the field on the remaining days, or did arm stress and recovery prohibit that from becoming reality?
I think he was pretty much done being a pitcher. He, at that point, when the Red Sox start moving him over, and it was done during World War I believe, and he starts playing a little bit more. He wants to play every day, but he's not as interested in pitching every day.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was a big area of contention between him and the Red Sox. The Red Sox want him to be a pitcher, and he doesn't want to be a pitcher anymore. Mm-hmm. So I think that's also some of the foundation of the Red Sox pursuing a sale. And I'm always careful because people are like, oh, well, he was traded to the Yankees. He was not traded to the Yankees. He was sold. His contract was sold. There was an exchange of money, but there was never another player involved in that. It was a one-way deal.
Babe said, quote, I picked Ty Cobb as the greatest natural hitter I ever saw, despite the fact that personally I found him easy to pitch to. I can name a dozen men in the league who gave me a lot more trouble. Joe Jackson was one. But despite that, I still consider Cobb the king of them all when it comes to hitters. Was there anyone who always hit Babe really well when he was pitching? Was there a hitter that he could not get out?
Oh, I'm sure there was, but I can't recall off the top of my head. It's very interesting because really Babe admires Joe Jackson. That's the one he watches, and that's the other thing that people tend to forget. Babe was a pitcher, and he and Jackson overlapped their careers for a fair amount of time. I believe Babe pitched to him 39 times. There was 39 at-bats. So you have a pitcher who can study a batter, and if he likes him, which Babe did, Babe truly liked Jackson, and he's watching him and how he's doing it. So Jackson hit well off him. I think he had a 282 batting average against the Babe, which was better than most.
Yeah.
So he's got to respect that. But Babe is smart enough to figure out what's he doing and is it something he can learn from.
Right, yeah. When you look at his statistics and compare them to players today, or even the great players of baseball history, Babe is still incredibly impressive and still arguably the greatest player of all time. But to measure his career by what he was doing against his peers is what is truly mind-blowing. For instance, Luke Voigt led the majors with 22 home runs this season because it was shortened, and that's the fewest amount of home runs to lead the majors since 1918, when Babe Ruth, who was still with Boston at the time, and Tilly Walker of Philadelphia tied for the league lead with 11 home runs. So that's the type of number that used to lead the league in home runs. Then Babe hit 29 in 1919. Second place had 10. Then the live ball era started in 1920, and Babe hit 54 home runs. Second place had 19. In 1921, he hit 59 home runs, and second place had 24. So you look at his career total of 714 and think, yeah, but he's only in third place now. But when he retired in 1935, second place all-time was Lou Gehrig with 378. So the difference would be the equivalent today, somebody retiring with 1,439 home runs. That's the same discrepancy between first and second place that was when Babe retired. It's insane to think how much better he was than everybody who was playing at the time and everybody who had come before him.
Absolutely. And the statistic I give is the 1919 season. You know, the Red Sox hit 32 home runs that season, and 29 of them come from Babe. 2 come from another guy, and 1 come from another one. And that's it for the entire and if you look at those seasons, when Babe starts hitting those numbers, he's surpassing entire team totals. not individuals, but entire teams, totals. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. Ty Cobb represented the past era. It was a different type of baseball. Home runs were not necessarily sought after. Babe kind of changes that because the fans love it. But baseball's a very different game prior to that. And when they start selling tickets and filling seats, baseball's a business. It decides to adapt. And all the players that were his contemporaries, most of them had learned a different style of baseball.
Right.
So I think there's that we have to keep in mind. But two, you're absolutely right in the sense that this is out of this world. This guy is doing things that today would be crazy. It would be absolutely crazy for us to try to imagine. But he's doing it, and that's what makes him a rock star. I mean, that's what makes him perfect for the headlines. And, he epitomizes the 1920s, and this is how he does it.
Yeah.
And he's not just headlines in New York papers and previously Boston papers, but he's headlines around the country. And he just kind of fits the bill, which is interesting because Lou Gehrig doesn't fit that bill. Lou's not the flashy guy. Lou just kind of comes up and does his thing every day.
2,130 days in a row.
Exactly. Which means something in Baltimore.
Right.
But, we were talking earlier that Joe Jackson, talk about what if. I think baseball got cheated out of probably the greatest rivalry. And it would not have just been Yankees versus White Sox, New York versus Chicago, East versus West. Now, these are two very different people, personality-wise. But, imagine if that home run race was going on between the two of them.
Right.
And especially, Babe noting that he had modeled his stance and a little bit of his swing after Jackson's. And how much fun we would have to be looking at some of the footage from years back, comparing where they put their feet. And we know that, Babe modeled after he put the right foot a little bit more forward and the left foot a little bit farther back, so he got a better pivot, and he got that from Jackson. Baseball was cheated at probably the biggest rivalry ever.
As great as Joe was as a hitter, in 1920, Babe hit 54 home runs, led the league. Joe finished fifth. He had 12. So they were just two completely different style hitters. And like you mentioned earlier, it's because Joe kind of was from that previous era where home runs weren't a thing. He played mostly in the dead ball era. 1920 was the start of the live ball era, so it didn't make sense for people to have uppercut swings because that ball wasn't going over fences. So it would have been interesting to see, would Joe have adapted his swing to have that uppercut now knowing that these balls fly over fences, I can hit home runs? Or would he have continued to try and hit singles and doubles and triples and go for batting average over the home runs? But to watch them compete for the next decade would have really changed the history.
Well, it would have changed the history because things hadn't happened the way they did. And you had brought this up to me earlier, that imagine what the White Sox would have been in the 1920s.
Right.
Instead, the Yankees, Murderers Row and all that, were the dominant franchise. But the White Sox had the potential to be the same. So it's not inconceivable that some of those World Series that the Yankees got during that decade could have been the White Sox World Series.
Right.
It could have completely changed baseball. Now, again, hindsight's 20/20. Babe Ruth is often credited in the whole pursuit of home run records and such for saving baseball. It had brought fans back. It led to the creation of Yankee Stadium because the Polo Grounds just wasn't big enough. And the stadiums were now not big enough. He became a show by itself. Would that have happened? Who knows?
Right.
That's one of those things that, as you mentioned earlier, that's why Field of Dreams was a movie.
Right.
It makes all of us wonder what could have been, what should have been.
Babe Ruth only won the MVP award once during his career, which happened in 1923. That year, he hit more home runs by himself than every single team besides Philadelphia. But most people don't realize that the rules at the time were that once you won an MVP award once, you couldn't win it again. So if the rules were like they are today, how many MVP awards should Babe have won?
Oh, my golly. Well, wow.
Do you have enough fingers? Do you need mine?
Wow. It's tough because even, in the early 30s, Babe was no longer quite what he was. But I say that thinking that, what team wouldn't have still wanted that kind of power in their lineup?
More than one is
absolutely
a safe answer.
a lot more than one. A lot more than one.
Yeah. As great as Babe was, though, there are still some people who say that his home run totals and subsequently his batting average, his on-base percentage, his slugging percentage, RBI, they were only so high because of the short dimensions in Yankee Stadium. The right field foul pole wasn't even 300 feet from home plate. And yes, he was still hitting balls 548 feet like he did at Shibe Park on May 22nd, 1930, which would clearly be a home run in any stadium. But their point is, surely there were also dozens of home runs hit in Yankee Stadium that were hit like 310 feet, and in any other stadium it would just be an easy fly ball out. So what do you say to people when they challenge the legitimacy of Babe's greatness with points like that?
There's an author by the name of Bill Jenkinson who has documented every one of Babe Ruth's home runs, triples, doubles, singles. And if we use today's ballparks as the model, a lot of Babe's doubles would have been home runs. His triples would have definitely been home runs. So it's really hard to go, and that's one of the oddities and beauties at the same time of baseball, is that each ballpark is different and has its own characteristics and its own personalities. And people say that about Oriole Park, it's an easy ballpark to hit in. But if that were the case, then all the other teams would have the same kind of records,
right?
And when you compare Babe's numbers to all of his contemporaries, and there were a few that were having, a stellar season here and there, no one did it consistently like he did. And I honestly don't think it would matter. There was also a time when, and we have the audio of Babe telling the story here, that a home run didn't count as a home run. So if you had, a tied game and a runner on third, and Babe comes up and hits a home run, it only counts as a single.
Right.
Do we go back and figure out all those? Do we put a star next to his name and said, oh, he would have had more home runs if we had considered these? That's the what-ifs again of baseball.
Yeah. Obviously, most players over the course of their career play a similar amount of games at home and on the road because half your games are at home and half are on the road. So over the course of his career, Babe played 2 more games at home than he did on the road. He hit 20 more home runs on the road than he did at home during his career. So it's not like he only hit home runs at Yankee Stadium. In fact, Babe had more runs, more hits, more doubles, more total bases, and more RBIs on the road than he did at home during his career. But he seemed to especially love playing in Philadelphia, where his career stats at Shibe Park were in 171 career games. He slashed .357, .472, and .753 with a 12.25 OPS, 68 home runs, 175 RBI, 164 runs, 220 hits, 132 walks, and 464 total bases. Like, it's crazy. 171 games is basically equivalent to just a little over a season. So to put up those numbers over the course of a season, and that's not in a hitter-friendly ballpark,
Right. Did you say 145 RBIs?
175.
Oh, I'm sorry, 175. I cheated him. I cheated him out of 30.
It's crazy.
It's absolutely crazy. It's absolutely crazy. And again, we talk about it being American Hercules.
Yeah.
And he really is. He's the American Hercules. Major League Baseball called him that. And there's some truth to it because there's something mythical about him. There's something that is not just extraordinary, but beyond extraordinary. And statistics is always interesting because you can analyze the data. And I love baseball for that reason, is because the rules have changed so little in baseball that you can kind of look at that kind of data and go back and do comparisons. But he's a league of his own. He's absolutely a league of his own. And it's a shame for me that he didn't get a chance to manage, because I would have loved to see if he could have translated. What could he have done if he had become teacher in addition to being a ball player? What would he have done with young players? And we'll never know that.
One of the things that Babe was famous for was just how much he traveled to play baseball all year round, all over the globe. He played in exhibitions and all-star events and the U.S. tour of Japan in 1934, and he barnstormed all over the country in big cities and little towns alike. Do you have a favorite story of what happened in a non-major league game that he played in?
I do, and it was the tour of Japan, 1934, and they're sailing over there, and Claire's with Babe, and so is Julia, and so is Mo Berg. Now, you may or may not be familiar with Mo Berg. We learned later that Mo worked for the OSS. He was a legitimate ball player, spoke 6 different languages that we know of. Mm-hmm. Trying to remember, somebody said he spoke 6 different languages and couldn't hit in any of them. But Mo Berg is a brilliant ball player in his own right. Not all-star quality, but he's good. And Babe says to him on the ship, "So, Mo, do you speak Japanese?" And he said, "I do not." And 2 weeks or whatever time it took him to get to Japan, they get to Japan, and Mo's getting off the ship, and he's greeting everybody in Japanese. And Babe says, "What the heck? You told me you didn't speak Japanese." And he said, "Well, that was 2 weeks ago."
Yeah, I didn't back then.
Right. And I love that, because even Babe was floored by who is
Right.
this guy?
Yeah.
Those are the kind of stories I like. One of the other stories that I liked a lot was that in New Jersey, there was heavy rains, and it was a washout of train tracks. Some kids had discovered that there was a washout, and they ran as far down the tracks as they could and waved down the oncoming passenger train. And the engineer was concerned enough of all these kids freaking out that he stopped and avoided a huge derailment, and which probably would have resulted in the loss of life. And the mayor of the town, or whoever it was that was in charge, said to the kids, "You're heroes. What do you want?" And the kids wanted Babe Ruth to know. They just wanted Babe Ruth to know what they had done. And in typical Babe Ruth fashion, he brought all the kids to Yankee Stadium. He had little uniforms made for them, and he made them sort of his guests and stars that day. And it's those stories, the amazing humanity
Right.
of him, that I enjoy so much. But there's a lot of those things. It's interesting. Bill Jenkinson is another one that told the story when he was doing research on some of Babe's home runs when he was barnstorming. Really found it difficult to do research like in Arkansas and some of those areas. And finally the archivist said to him, Babe was playing Negro League teams in the South, and in some situations he was lucky to get out of town with just bad press. And again, for me, that says something more about the character of the man. I don't think it was about money. I don't think he was making a lot of money barnstorming against Negro League teams. But he certainly knew who the players were, and I think he certainly respected a lot of them.
Absolutely. And you mentioned before about him wanting to be a manager, and he said that was one of his greatest regrets, is that he never had the chance to become one. Babe was a huge advocate for the Negro Leagues and barnstorm with black players all over the place. He would sing their praises whenever he could, and there's speculation that Commissioner Kennesaw Mountain Landis actively worked to keep Babe from managing a major league team because he was afraid that Babe was going to bring black players to his team and break the color barrier. Have you found anything that confirms or denies those theories?
I've seen some things that certainly suggest that, and I do believe it. I absolutely do believe it. Now, I don't think Babe was out there.
What part of it do you believe? That Kennesaw Mountain Landis worked against him, or that Babe would have broken the color barrier?
I think both.
Interesting.
I think both. And I think Landis knew that.
Yeah.
But Babe was not as vocal. Babe is in his actions. We know he played against and didn't think twice about playing teams in Section 8. Not like Ted Williams, who was much more vocal about it later on.
Right.
So I can't give Babe credit for being out there and being a loud vocal champion, because I just don't think he was. But his actions certainly supported that notion. But I unfortunately can't pinpoint a moment where he said this or said that. But I do believe that was a major factor in him not being able to manage.
Interesting.
And just I think Kennesaw Mountain Landis just liked him so much.
Yeah.
And he didn't like Landis any better. That was almost punishment.
Yeah. What about the speculation that Babe himself was part black?
Not true. We know the lineage. We know his family members. We've got the family tree. It's not true.
Is there one story or statistic that you were most disappointed in finding out wasn't true upon further research?
Wow, that's a good question. No, not really, because there's so much about this man that is already extraordinary that you don't want it to be unbelievable. And I actually like that he had vulnerabilities, and I like that he wasn't perfect at everything he did, and that sort of thing. That there is a real person there. That's one of the things that we try to do here, is we try to portray Babe as a real person, and not get caught up in the myth, and not get caught up in making him this icon that should be on Mount Rushmore.
Yeah, you tell the story of his humanity, not of his superhumanity.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And, he certainly had shortcomings. His first wife will tell you all about those. But, I think in overall, he's a pretty amazing guy, and I think that's enough.
Yeah. What about the opposite? Like something that you heard that at the time sounded crazy, but the more research you did, you were able to confirm that actually that did happen or that was true.
Not so much, not so much. There really isn't. I mean, and that's just it. There's not a lot about, we are still learning things every day about him, but there really isn't a lot out there anymore that we didn't know. Now, in the past few years, we've learned a little bit more about his childhood and his upbringing and some of the sadness that goes along with that. It's not a pretty story, and I think the divorce of the parents was not something that anyone ever knew about, and some of the indiscretions of his mother was not any, they knew. Babe's daughter certainly knew when she was confronted with it. She wasn't shocked. She wasn't anything. She knew the story.
Right.
I think she intended to take it to her grave with her, and it got out before then. But, there's very little new information. Now, I say that, and an author just came out with a book 2 years ago. Her name is Jane Levy. And the book is The Big Fella, and that's probably the most thorough examination of Babe Ruth that I've ever seen. I mean that you take all of the other examinations and kind of put them together, and that's pretty amazing portrayal of this man and the complexity of him. We always see him as a sort of the simple, as I said, happy-go-lucky, almost buffoon, and he's not. He's certainly not.
What is the most rewarding thing about being a Babe Ruth historian and researcher?
It is amazing to me, and having done this now for a number of years, that there are children from all over the world, boys, girls, whatever country, they still know who Babe Ruth is. And here in Maryland, it used to be you'd ask how many people know who Brooks Robinson is, and everybody would raise their hand. Now with kids, not so many. Now you're hard-pressed to get one or two to raise their hand. And Brooks is still around, and he's a great guy. Then it was Cal Ripken, and everybody knew Cal Ripken. And now it's a little bit, there's fewer and fewer, and now maybe half know who Cal Ripken was. But with Babe Ruth, it's still
Everyone.
Right out there.
Yeah.
And I'm amazed every day that kids come through, and I met some this weekend, and a young man came into the museum. He was probably like 6 or 7, and his mother said to me, he's the biggest Babe Ruth fan. And, I'm always happy to hear that. But then you have to wonder, how did he become a Babe Ruth fan?
Right.
And I guess it is because of the myth and the stories, but he's just special, and that gives me energy. That ignites my passion, is when you see people, young kids in particular, and they're excited about baseball, and they've seen a movie or they've seen a documentary or they read a book. We get so many letters every year that are addressed either to Babe or to one of Babe's family members that are written from kids. And I don't want to be the one to disappoint them that it's not Babe writing back to them. So you always start with, thank you for your letter to the Babe.
Yeah.
I'm sure he would have loved it.
Yeah.
Well,
to me, it's Babe Ruth is more than just a person. He is an adjective. When you are the Babe Ruth of whatever field you're in, everybody knows that means you're the best who does it. And when you've achieved that status, you transcend life. He's been dead since 1948 now, so 72 years. And people, they remember the career and they remember some of the statistics, but it's about the persona and the impact culturally, not just on baseball, but culturally. To me, that's why here we are still sitting here talking about him, and people who walk through your doors that were born 90 years after he was are like, yeah, he's my favorite player. But that shows you how incredible he was and the impact that he had and still has to this day.
Yeah, I think so. And we come back to, he is an American icon. He's not just a sports icon, but he is a truly American icon. I'd even say he's a Japanese icon because he's got a huge following in Japan and in South Korea as well. But he is an American icon, and we only have a few of those. Babe Ruth, Marilyn Monroe, maybe Elvis, James Dean to a lesser extent, but nonetheless somehow personify America. His stature in that group has always been strong and remains strong. And I think part of that, again, is that he is the story that any kid from any background, any walk of life can make it. He is the American dream. And not just in being successful at what you do, but being the greatest baseball player of all times. How fun is that?
Right.
What a great thing to dream of being. And he did. And I showed you we have a hymnal here from St. Mary's, and it's inscribed on the inside that says, George H. Ruth, world's worst singer, world's best pitcher. And we figure he's somewhere around 12, 13, 14 years old when he does it. He already was aspiring to be the best.
Right.
And he was already telling people he was the best.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe that's something that we all like. And we do kind of like those success stories.
Yeah. Does it ever feel like a burden to be the authority on Babe Ruth? Not necessarily you individually, but the museum. And when people come here, they take every word that you guys say as the gospel truth. Is that ever daunting?
Well, only in the interviews like this. No, I'm just teasing. Sometimes it is, absolutely. And there are also people that almost want to pick a fight. They want to challenge and they want to argue, and that's not my nature. I'm a storyteller, if you haven't guessed that already. But it came to me a few years ago when Babe Ruth's daughter called me. And now we've had a long relationship with Julia, so I'm not trying to drop names or anything, but Julia's been a long part of this institution since it was founded. But she called me one day because she had heard that I had just become the executive director. And, it was Friday at 5 o'clock, and I pick up my phone, and she's like, Shawn, it's Julia. And she spent 30 seconds congratulating me on getting the job, and then 45 minutes and 30 seconds explaining to me the enormous responsibility that I now had to perpetuate Daddy's legacy. Her words, not mine. And it was at that moment that I felt like this block had just been put on my shoulders, that there is an enormous responsibility. Now, I don't think we should have the answers. There's a lot of smart people out there doing a lot of research and doing a lot of hard work on Babe Ruth. I think it's our job to make sure the dialogue keeps going. And I think any of us that are in the sports heritage field, that's what we try to do. Yeah. There are lessons to be learned. There are things to celebrate. There are things to not celebrate. And I tell Marylanders that we don't have in the Jackie Robinson story, Baltimore doesn't have a great place in the history. We chased Jackie Robinson off the field, and he had to lock himself into the clubhouse because an angry mob in Baltimore wasn't happy that he was here. Mm-hmm. Should we celebrate that? No. But should we be aware of it? Yes. Should we teach it? Absolutely. Do we need to learn from it? Always. And I think that's what those of us in the sports heritage business do. I'm not here to be Babe Ruth's biggest advocate or cheerleader. I'll call out when, there's some behaviors that were unbecoming, but I try hard to look at the big picture, and the lesson there is for all of us to look at a human being in the big picture, not one particular moment and one particular event.
Yeah. Well said. As part of your museum, you guys have an audio and video archives, which is an incredible resource and advantage that you guys have over the Shoeless Joe Jackson Museum. What's been the most interesting recording that you've come across as you've explored those archives?
Some of the old radio shows, because they were so brand new. Radio was new. It was before television, and listening to Babe, and they're scripted, and listening to him try to give the answers, and he starts to laugh or he starts to giggle because he even knows that this sounds ridiculous. And those always bring a smile to my face. And there's one in particular that was a radio show, and I don't even remember what show it was now, but Babe and Claire were the first two guests ever on the radio show. And it already sounds like a disaster in the making. And so they start addressing each other. So Claire is asked a question, and she kind of looks over. You can imagine her looking over at Babe going, "Well, Mr. Ruth," and then he responds, "Well, Mrs. Ruth," and they start this banter back and forth, addressing each other, and you could start to hear them giggling, and it's still going because it was a live radio show, and that's the kind of stuff that again, the humanity.
Right.
There's a real human person. There's
Yeah.
a real person in there. We have a piece downstairs that shows him that he's boxing with a trainer, and they know the camera's running, so they're kind of play boxing, and the trainer's kind of hitting Babe in the belly, and he finally is like, "What are you doing?" And he takes the glove, holds the guy on top of the head, and then smacks him. And he smacks him too hard because the guy goes tumbling across the room, and Babe's laughing because he knew that was a little bit more of a punch than we were supposed to do. And again, the humanity of it is
Yeah.
is amazing.
Yeah. You guys have so many incredible artifacts at this museum. If you could have any artifact or piece of memorabilia from Babe's career for the museum that you don't already have, what piece out there, whether you know that it currently exists or something that you're just like, oh yeah, it'd be cool to have this thing that must have existed at one point, but we don't know where it is now. What would you like to be able to display here?
A Babe Ruth jersey. We had one, and it was on loan to us. I mean, they're hard to find.
Yeah.
And the craziness now about sports collectibles is that, the last Babe Ruth jersey, I think, sold for like $3 million.
Yeah.
We're a small nonprofit. We don't have $3 million. So, a Babe Ruth jersey would be, of course, the number one thing. We have a couple of his bats, which we're fortunate to have.
Yeah.
And a bunch of his personal items, which are great. But my golly, it's hard to tell the story. We have pants. So we have Babe Ruth pants, but we don't have his jersey.
If you could take one item home to have in your personal collection, what would you take from this museum? And because you're not just the Babe Ruth Museum.
Well, we're the official Orioles Museum. We are the official Baltimore Colts archive, and we also maintain the Baltimore Ravens collection for them. So we've got a number of baseball, football. We have the Maryland Athletic Hall of Fame collection. So we have a whole bunch of stuff here. But quite honestly, and most people, I think, and listeners don't understand this, is that when you do something all day long, it's probably the last thing you want to bring home with you. And so I've always heard that over the years. People are like, you must have a great collection. But I will say this. So one event we had here, Julia Ruth Stevens was still with us, and she had autographed a photo of her and her father. And my other half decided, wouldn't that be a great gift? And bought it at the silent auction and surprised me with it when I got home. And I'm like, you paid for a photo of Julia Ruth Stevens that I could have just got her to sign? Okay, great, thank you. Appreciate that. And then insisted we hang it up. So...
right over your bed.
Worse. Coming out of my bathroom. So in the morning when I'm finishing up my shower and I open up the door, there's Julia Ruth Stevens and Babe Ruth looking back at me. And that's the only thing Babe Ruth related I have in my house. And I am not allowed to take it down.
Yeah. Did Babe keep anything as a memento, either from his playing days or just anything personal? I mean, you've got the rosary. Was there anything else like that?
Well, from his playing days, he kept some things. He kept some of his bats. He kept some of his materials. I don't know if he did it as much as Claire did it, because Babe gave a lot of stuff away, and stuff was just stuff to him. So we have a bunch of the stuff from the Japanese tour, the All-American tour in Japan, and he was pretty passionate about that stuff. He really enjoyed that tour, loved Japan until the attack on Pearl Harbor, and then he started throwing all the stuff out of the window of their high-rise in New York City. Claire sent Julia and Dorothy down into the street to try to retrieve what they could. I don't think he saved a lot of his baseball stuff. That wasn't his thing.
Interesting. What kind of assistance, whether it's financial or otherwise, have you gotten from Major League Baseball or from individual teams or players?
So the assistance that we get is not cash. It's not, a financial one. So we are the official museum of the Baltimore Orioles, and the Baltimore Orioles use their media and marketing arms to support us. They encourage visiting team media to come to the museum and tour, and so we end up making, the B-roll of whatever visiting team is in town. They'll help us using their social media to promote things. Major League Baseball is a little more difficult just because it's a bigger entity, but they have some of the best research materials available and well organized, so we've been able to use and access a lot of Babe Ruth footage. What we try to do there is if we come across something that they don't have, we try to share it back and forth. So the support is not necessarily direct support. We're not receiving an annual check from the clubs. And baseball is more complicated. I'm not sure people understand this, but we live in Baltimore, which is Orioles territory. So Yankees would not be able to do anything in this region without the Orioles signing off on it.
Interesting.
And that's how it's done with all of the clubs around the country. and what they perceive to be their territory. So on the East Coast, the territories are pretty clearly defined. In the Midwest, it's a little more complicated, especially if you're talking in areas like Kentucky, where the Atlanta Braves consider that part of their territory, but the Cincinnati Reds consider it their territory, and
or
even
states like Iowa, where the blackout rules prevent you from watching 6 different teams.
Right. And so the ownerships also respect that. So the Yankees, we have a relationship with their museum, but we don't have a relationship with their club because, ours is with the Orioles.
Right.
That's just the way the world works.
Yeah.
It's more complicated.
Yeah.
Yeah. And same for us on the football side, because we are the official Baltimore Colts archive, and the Colts still exist.
Right.
But we are a Ravens town. So we have a really good relationship with the Baltimore Ravens. We do not have a good relationship with the Indianapolis Colts.
Interesting.
And I think most of the old Colts fans would absolutely crucify me if I tried to have a relationship with the Indianapolis Colts.
Understood. How can people join the museum or donate to it if they want to help support the cause?
Well, you can visit our website, www.baberuthmuseum.org. And if you're not able to visit us right now, we have a lot going on in this world. We're trying to do more virtually. So, we're on Facebook, we're on Instagram, we have a YouTube channel. We have been doing live interviews with different athletes around the country on a variety of topics, and those are available through YouTube and through Facebook. And the amazing thing about even in this world that we're living in currently is that we are now doing so much virtually, and that the schools are now trying to go virtual, and we know a lot of parents are struggling right now with at-home learning. Museums are doing the same thing. We're trying to do more things virtually, and our mission is to preserve and interpret Babe Ruth and the local sports heritage. And we can do some of that virtually. It's not the same as coming through the door and supporting the institution, but right now our cultural institutions do need support. Many of them were hand-to-mouth before this even started. And, the American Alliance of Museums is estimating that 30 to 40% of museums may not survive this COVID-19 pandemic. If you're not going to get involved with the Babe Ruth Museum, find a museum in your locality to be involved in, because I think it's really important, especially in this day and age, that we support our cultural organizations. Maybe not coming to the door right now is a good thing, but if we have a store, maybe you buy your next book here instead of Amazon, or you're looking at a birthday gift and it's a T-shirt out of the Babe Ruth Museum store, or it's a donation that is tax deductible. Or it's a membership because you want to stay connected and hear more about interviews and interactions with athletes. But I think whether it's a sports museum or whatever, there's a lot of organizations that are going to need our help in the coming months and in the next year. And if you don't want these things to go away, now's a good time to do something.
Right, absolutely. How can people reach out to you if they want to get in touch or follow you on social media, follow the Babe Ruth Museum on social media? What are your guys' handles?
Hashtag Babe Ruth Museum. Pretty simple. We've kept it. Now we're predominantly on Facebook and Instagram. We do have a smaller YouTube presence. We don't do Twitter anymore. Twitter is hard to do when you don't have content every single day. So right now Facebook and Instagram seem to be the better avenues for us. Fortunately, we have somebody who's much younger and much more savvy than myself doing this, but we've done some amazing things recently using those platforms.
Yeah.
A cute story is I had a high school student 2 years ago interview, and he was going to create some of our first YouTube videos. And so we were literally doing like a curator's corner. We were taking an object and telling you about it for 2 to 3 minutes. And this young man comes in to interview with me, and I said, well, do you know anything about doing videos on YouTube? And he looked at me like I was insane, tilted his head, and he said, I'm 17. I'm like, oh, yeah, sorry.
It's all I do.
That's right. He knew all about it.
Yeah, he's like, do you know anything about YouTube videos?
Not a thing. Not a thing. And to his credit, that 17-year-old created the platform that we're now using today. He created the model, and the videos that we have done were based on his work. So
awesome.
And that's the other thing, is you find friends in all walks of life. Everybody has something to offer. You never turn people away.
Is there anything that we didn't cover that you would have liked to have gotten to, or one lasting thing that you want people to take away from this interview about Babe Ruth, the person, or the Babe Ruth Museum, or anything?
I think one thing for all of us to keep in mind is that, history can judge somebody harshly because we're looking backwards. And whether it's Babe Ruth or Joe Jackson or whomever, we have to look at them as real people and what the environment they were in at the time. It's easy for us to pass judgment now, hindsight 2020, but there's a whole bunch of people that really deserve the benefit of the doubt. And I don't think Babe would be who he is today if he was judged by the criteria that we judge people today.
Mm-hmm.
It's a different age, it's a different media. He would be viewed very differently, I think, than he was in the 19-teens and the 1920s. And that's the unfortunate part of making comparisons. In the sports museum business, we get into discussions about who should be in a Hall of Fame, and can you take somebody out of a Hall of Fame? Because when they were inducted, you thought they were one person, and then you found out later they were another person. And there's no right or wrong answer there. But I think we need to be a little bit more forgiving and a little bit more understanding that even the people we hold up as these great models, at the end of the day, are human beings with real human issues.
Yeah, that's one of the things that we try and teach at our museum too, is that you might know one story about him, but that's not necessarily the entire picture of who the man was.
That's right.
So yeah, definitely very similar goals in our two missions.
Yeah, and you can apply that across the board. I mean, we're going to look at people 20 years from now very differently than we do right at this moment. As we look back, people 20 years ago, and look back at them and say, oh, well, yeah, what they did either wasn't that bad or it really wasn't as good as we made it out to be.
Mm-hmm.
It was at that moment that we have to kind of remember what we were thinking.
Yeah.
So for us, the lasting power is that Babe Ruth continues to weather the storm well. He continues to be an icon, and I think there's enough of the genuine person that comes through that people like. And I think at the end of the day, we like people who are genuine, and we accept him with all of his flaws as well as all of his accomplishments.
Right. Shawn, thank you so much for sitting down with us and showing us around your museum and just giving us this day. This was an incredible opportunity for us, so thank you so much.
My pleasure, and come on back to Baltimore because we have so much to offer here. We're the birthplace of the Star-Spangled Banner with Fort McHenry. We're the birthplace of American railroading. We're the birthplace of Michael Phelps. Great music, great art. This is a great town, and when we're all allowed to travel again, we should all challenge ourselves to get in our vehicles or plane or train or whatever and go check out a place we haven't been to. So maybe I'll come down and see you.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't even really talk about his Major League Baseball career. It was mostly about the person, so we'll definitely have to do this again and talk about his Red Sox days and the Yankees days, which we didn't even get to at all.
Right.
So, yeah, we'll do this again.
Deal.
Cool. Thank you so much. All right, now it's time for a segment called What'd You Think, Mom?, where we talk to my mom who just listened to the interview with me, and we ask her what she thinks. This is my real, actual mom. Her name is Lori, but I've always just called her Mom. Can you say something to prove that you are my mom?
Yeah, so I'm the mom that was talked into redoing a suburban bathroom with AstroTurf on the walls by a teenage Dan Wallach, who was so upset because I didn't get his vision of the iconic Yankee fencing.
The facade. Get the word right.
All right. Go back.
No, we're leaving this in. Just get the word right. It's not a fencing. It's a facade.
So you pull out a sheet of paper, you sketch it out, and you're like, yeah, we're going to do that. And I had no clue because I just was not quite the Yankee fan that you were. But nonetheless, there you were, and everything else came off except for the Yankee facade, which now, ironically, we have in our South Carolina home. But thinking back to that moment of the finished product of how awesome that whole arrangement looked, and your vision was spot on, and how for years until we sold that house, I believe, there was a photograph of Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig on their barnstorming tour. And there you go. I mean, so many things in your early life pointed to where we are right now, sitting across after having been lucky enough to visit the Babe Ruth Birthplace and Museum in Baltimore and having a phenomenal tour there with Shawn.
Yeah, Shawn was just great. And we kind of touched on it a little bit in the interview, but that is more than just the Babe Ruth Museum. It is basically the history of sports in Baltimore museum. So they have all sorts of really awesome artifacts, not all of them on display, but since we kind of got a behind the scenes tour, we were able to go down in their vault and touch the jersey that Johnny Unitas wore and hold the contract that Brooks Robinson signed and gold gloves that people won and all sorts of just incredible artifacts that aren't even on display. So imagine the stuff that they do have on display.
It was amazing, and Shawn could not have been more gracious. Did not really realize until we got there the full impact of what there being the repository for all these sports legend items would be, not only for the major leagues of the different sports, but also Michael Phelps and some other Olympic athletes that came from Baltimore. So that was great and really enjoyed it. I think he was saying, and we saw, it's the only place where you can see the 2 championship trophies for baseball and for football. Mm-hmm. Very cool.
Yeah, it was a really neat museum. And the first room was that video display of the Star Spangled Banner and the history of that song and how it came to be. So that was a cool way to kick off the tour and get you in like the baseball frame of mind, because so many people have those two things connected in their mind that they're synonymous with each other. You hear the Star Spangled Banner and okay, well now it's time to start a sporting event, because when else do you hear that song?
That video was so powerful. And the placement of it in that museum in Baltimore is critical and appropriate, because that is where the Star Spangled Banner was written. It was the Battle of Baltimore from the War of 1812. This battle happened in 1814. We know Francis Scott Key's name. He was being held on a British ship in the harbor during the battle, hoping that Fort McHenry in the harbor wouldn't be taken over, and he writes the song. And to celebrate the 200th anniversary of that event, the city of Baltimore reached out to all the different organizations within the city to say, can you incorporate something about the Star Spangled Banner in your programs for the year? And the Babe Ruth Birthplace Foundation created this video, and it will send chills down your spine. It's so powerful and really sets the tone for everything else you're going to see in that building.
Mm-hmm. Before we talk about what we got to see and experience at the museum, I think one of the things that Shawn and I brought up in the early part of the interview was the impact of losing 2020 as a year of sporting events and in-person gatherings. And, you know, we were only able to see that museum in person because we called ahead and made prior arrangements, and Shawn was gracious enough to open up the museum for us on their day off, and could not be more thankful. But it's so different to experience something when you're the only person there compared to when you'd be in a group of 20 people or 40 people or 30,000 people in a baseball stadium. And I think those are the types of things that people aren't understanding, the long-term impact that this year is going to have on people's lives and mental health and how people view community and getting together moving forward.
One of the really insightful comments that Shawn made talked about our ballparks serving the role that train stations served years ago in American society, where you can have different generations, different classes of people, different races, and you can be sitting next to someone for 4 innings and walk away a friend. You have the commonality of the love of the sport in front of you, and it's just a release from whatever else is going on outside the confines of those walls, and that is a great loss, no matter what you try to do virtually. It's just not quite the same. Though I do want to say I kind of enjoyed being in the museum without other people, because I love to really examine these artifacts and let my mind go to the place where they first were used or found or whatever, or absorbing the space that you're in. The whole reason that building is there is because Babe Ruth was born in a bedroom on the 2nd floor. And while you can't walk inside of the bedroom, it's kind of roped off because it's a very small room. You are right at the edge of it, looking in the small space and just seeing the German artifacts all around that are period. You can place yourself back in 1895 when he was born and get a feel for the humble beginnings of this guy. Being in the place is important to me, and I really got a lot out of it. So basically, the Birthplace and Museum is larger than what the original footprint was of his grandfather's leased property. And now the site contains 4 row houses on the street where they only lived in one. But the other space is used, obviously, for different exhibits and everything. But in the original footprint of the Ruth row house, you can see period furniture that is as authentic as it's going to get.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm saying that as the great-granddaughter of German immigrants, where some of those things that were in those rooms were passed down to me. I have them now in my house because that was what the heritage was. You know, to see a hand-stitched saying in German over the mantle of the fireplace, it was very appropriate. That is how it was. And so I think they did a really excellent job with trying to convey what the feel was in that house the day he was born.
Yeah, and I think when Shawn mentioned that not only did Lou Gehrig speak German, but Babe Ruth spoke German, that's not something you really consider.
Right.
That you think of somebody being bilingual today and you're like, oh, cool, they're, maybe born in another country, or they understand what global marketing is and they learn Spanish because, okay, well, now you can talk to this many more potential fans. But back in 1910, 1920, you weren't bilingual because you wanted to have global reach. You were bilingual because you were born and came here or had ancestors who came here. And that was a cool reminder that times were different back then. And that gave a really interesting insight to Babe Ruth, the person, which that's what this interview was. I mean, there's so many documentaries and television shows and movies and all sorts of things that are about Babe Ruth, the baseball player, and his career and his statistics and all that are well documented, but not too many people know the story of who he was as a person. So that's really what my goal was with this interview, and Shawn did a great job about Babe Ruth, the person.
I learned so much about Babe Ruth by going there, and I want to hit on something that we didn't really talk about while we were there, and that was being German. So he gets signed to a contract in 1914. World War I, or the Great War as they would have called it then, Germany is primarily the enemy during that war. And there were a lot of German Americans who were shunned or looked upon with disfavor or suspicion as were they in cahoots with the enemy. And here you have Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig going through that. Did they feel any of that, slight kickback of that? But I know just from personal history that was sometimes something to consider. And even though there were so many German immigrants in the United States at that time, but we see the same thing happen when Shawn talks about how much Babe enjoyed the tour to Japan. And he brings back a lot of souvenirs that he kept. And after Pearl Harbor, he goes to the window in his New York high-rise and starts pitching that stuff out because he's so infuriated because his patriotism runs so deep. And then Claire sends down, Dorothy and Julia to go get the stuff. But it's a common thread throughout humanity that you have that loyalty and fidelity to your country. And that says everything you want to see, So even though someone could be of German heritage, that doesn't necessarily mean anything when it's coming to a war like that.
Well, we talked about that in the Brian Bernardoni episode where he talked about Charlie Wiegman having that same exact thing,
right?
Where he was German and people kind of had their eyebrows raised at him in Chicago, and he went above and beyond to prove no, I'm an American now.
Right.
Just because my family's from Germany doesn't mean that that's where my loyalties lie.
Right.
So I wonder if Babe or Lou Gehrig or other people in that time did that same kind of thing, where almost to the point of overcompensating to prove no, I'm here, I'm one of you now.
Right.
Who would have guessed that in the year 2020 there'd be a podcast talking about Minnie Graff, the midwife who helped?
Right.
And
right.
Shawn brought that up too with Babe's mom and the alcoholism, that at the time you just think this is just a decision I'm making in my life. You don't ever consider that in 100 years people are still going to be discussing it, and that you'd be the source of a book, or those actions changed the course of American history and possibly world history. You just never think that one thing that you're doing is ever going to be that important. It's just a fleeting moment in your life. And here we are, still discussing it now, almost 130 years later. That's a wild concept to me.
That goes to how technology has changed and how it would have been so outside the realm. Someone today, your footprint is all over the place. But they would have not been able to even conceive. I mean, you think they had the first radio transmission that was of a ball game. But before that, they used carrier pigeons to fly the results of a game, like the inning by inning results, across New York with a carrier pigeon to get it to...
Yeah, times were different.
Yeah.
How many notes do you think got lost to the sands of time when they were trying to teach the pigeons how to go from one house to the other? Larry, go to Larry's house. It's a pigeon. It doesn't know anything.
Well, first you start going from room to room. Here, pigeon, pigeon, pigeon. Then you go next door. Then you go... Going back to Babe's mom and the delicate story and how once it was uncovered through modern research 4 or 5 years ago when it comes out that through court documents now you can read the whole transcript of the divorce trial. Babe Ruth's daughter knows. So when it comes out, she's like, doesn't bat an eye because, it's passed down in the family,
right? But
never out there for anybody else. So tell her something she doesn't know.
Right, yeah. She's sitting at the table with her legs crossed and goes, "What took you so long?"
Yeah. Yeah. One of the first things that Shawn pointed out to us when we were walking around, there are so many photographs, black and whites, of course, and the different smiles that Babe Ruth had.
Yes.
And his natural smile, and Shawn would say, he's really smiling here. And you think, well, what do you mean? Because he had his true smile and he had his PR smile.
Right.
When you look at the photographs as much as Shawn has, he can immediately identify, was this a PR shot or was it caught in the spur of the moment?
Right.
And those spur of the moment shots are the ones that are even more valuable because they do show the humanity that we were talking about throughout the interview.
Yeah, and I mean, everybody knows the story of Babe going to the hospital and promising a kid he's going to hit a home run or 2 home runs. And there are many photographs that I've seen of Babe out on the street, like playing stickball with kids or, literally just playing ball with a bunch of kids because that's what he thought was fun. And it wasn't because he knew cameras were around. So those types of things round out who he was as a person. And is that because he never really grew up, or he just knew that he wished that he had somebody like that around when he was a kid, and so he wanted to give that to these children? I guess that's up for interpretation, but Shawn brought up Christy Walsh and the role that he played. I never really knew too much about Christy Walsh. I'd heard the name, but didn't know anything about him.
Ditto.
And he sounds like, man, him and Babe Ruth were a match made in heaven at just the perfect time in history for that to happen. Like, as Shawn put it, somebody who understood public relations before public relations was a thing that existed. And that was both Babe Ruth and Christy Walsh. And, you had Christy Walsh negotiating contracts for Babe to endorse all sorts of products and ended up saving his life, basically, because he blew through all his earnings in his career and even the endorsement earnings. But then Christy Walsh had written into these contracts that, okay, a portion of that endorsement is going to come through in an annuity. Babe Ruth would have never thought to do that. And
right. Wasn't too happy when he did hear about it either.
So you've got people who are helping him, and Shawn brought up Claire Ruth as well. Those two people, who knows what kind of tragic ending the Babe Ruth story would have had. And it already kind of has a tragic ending. I mean, he died so much younger than he should have, but it could have been a Jimmy Fox ending or something like that. With just these two people, completely changed the perception and the public image of what we now think of as Babe Ruth.
Right. It was great on the national level for giving us this American icon, but also for Babe Ruth himself and giving him the life he was able to have. I want to go back to a second about how there's photographs of him playing ball with kids and how he adopted and sponsored what became the Babe Ruth Boys Band. There's a saying out there that says, you are what you were when. The concept behind that saying is everything that happens in your early life shapes who you are later in life. And you have your true north, you always go back to that. The empathy that he shows kids throughout his life, I think it would be a safe bet to say he is and always was who he was when. He knows what it felt like. If the story was out there that he was never visited by his father, of course, Shawn explained the logistics of that and why it wasn't so out of place as what it seemed like. But if Babe Ruth felt that way, then it doesn't matter because that was the reality. Perception is reality. And he knows what little boys felt like when they were in that school and in that place where they didn't have the visitors. They didn't have quite the same thing. And he knows how he felt about the two brothers. And so he wants to give back and wants to lift them up the way he was lifted up by those two brothers.
The Zavarian brothers, Brother Matthias and Brother Gilbert.
Right.
I mentioned this in the interview. I had heard the name Brother Matthias so many times growing up, and he was always the hero of the Babe Ruth story. You know, when you'd read about it in books, that this is the guy who taught Babe Ruth how to throw and how to hit and discovered this untapped potential. But hearing Babe Ruth talk about it in interviews since then and doing reading and things, he mentions Brother Gilbert's name more often, which I found interesting. And then come to find out there's another guy, Brother Paul Scanlon, who was the superintendent, who was actually Babe's legal guardian and was the person who signed away his contract when Babe signed with the Baltimore Orioles to Jack Dunn. It was Brother Paul Scanlon who gave the authority to let Babe go out in the wild. So yeah, a few different names that I had never really heard before or didn't know enough about. But when we were at the museum, Shawn mentioned that the relationship that Babe and his dad had was still there. And even though George Sr. put Babe in the school, he would still come visit occasionally and went to that baseball game. And after Babe went to the majors, he came back and didn't he buy his dad another bar and a saloon and work there in the off season? So
There's a huge photograph of them there, happy.
Right.
Natural smile.
I had never heard that story. I knew he wasn't an orphan because you know the story about his parents giving him away to the school, but so many people thought he was just straight up an orphan and that there was absolutely no relationship with his parents and not his father. And come to find out, no, they were kind of cool.
Yeah.
So that was nice to learn and to find out and to see the proof. Like they're standing behind the bar with each other, all decorated nicely. And that was cool to learn that kind of stuff, where those are the stories we want to tell at our museum too. It's not just what you saw in 8 Men Out. It's not just what you saw in the movie Babe or Pride of the Yankees, and you see these little snippets of who people want you to think that person is. No, this is who they were. We've got the proof. It's a photograph he's in.
Right. Shawn used the terms buffoon and cartoon-like in the way that a lot of people described Babe, or sometimes the way he's even portrayed now. But then he also talked about he knows the real story because of everything that he has in front of him. And he knows that Babe was a smart man, a deeper, sensitive, compassionate man than what the stereotypical PR version was. And it makes me think of Joe as well, because Joe was also somebody that the country bumpkin image was given him. And there's a quote from Joe saying, "That's okay, let them think that. I'm going to be sly like a fox."
Yeah, basically saying if I had let on that I was as smart as I was, they would have probably taken me more seriously at the plate. And because they all thought I was stupid, I hit 356.
Right.
That's definitely the impression that you get with Babe, is that not that he was taking advantage of people to better his playing career, but hey, if this is what everybody needs to have a better time when I'm around, it needs to think that I'm a fun person to be around, so be it. I'm happy to be the butt of the joke as long as I'm included in it. And it takes a special kind of person to be able to put up with that, and not only put up with it, but encourage it and welcome it.
And use it to your benefit.
Right.
Joe's comment about, go ahead, think of me what you will, but I'm going to hit 356 off of you, dovetails into Babe being a pitcher who pitched to Joe. And that's something not in the realm of how you normally think of the relationship between Babe Ruth and Joe Jackson of pitcher-batter.
Right.
But that makes Babe's famous comment about how he modeled his swing off of Joe's even more profound, because he was studying Joe's swing as a pitcher and looking at, how am I going to get this guy out at the plate? So what are his weaknesses? What are his strengths? And then modeling his foot stance accordingly to bring power to himself. It's another whole dynamic to their story. And when Shawn talks about how America was robbed of that greatest rivalry of what would have been, that would have been just so interesting because they had respect for each other. Shawn made a comment that Babe truly liked Joe. A lot of contemporary players of his really liked Joe.
Yeah.
He was a straight-up guy. What you see is what you got. It would have been something to see.
And that also goes to show how smart Babe Ruth was, that on the pitcher's mound, he was doing more than just trying to get people out. He was studying how can I be better when I'm the person standing in that batter's box? And I think it worked out pretty well for him.
The stats that you guys were talking about, just mind-boggling on the face of them. But then when you hear about Bill Jenkinson documenting every single home run, triple, double, single that Babe hit and comparing those against the confines of current-day ballparks where his triples would be home runs, now my head wants to go, because his already outrageous numbers documented. In reality, if you want to go apples to apples, are even more great.
Right. And Shawn used the phrase the Ruthian record.
Right.
Which was an interesting one. 206 records that he set throughout his career. That's so many records. It's just so much records.
So many records.
206. And when Roger Maris was going after one of them.
Yes, that's it.
It was, here we are 59 years later still talking about that summer.
Right.
And it was one record.
Right. Something else that we talked about was how Babe Ruth, until the day he died, was waiting for a phone call to become a manager of a team, and that call never came. How crazy is that he's left on a shelf from the time he retires to the time he dies, and his wisdom and his guidance and his total knowledge of the game, this guy owned it like nobody else did, and it's all sitting there for naught once he hangs up the cleats.
Yeah, and that's a shame. I think he deserved a chance, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he would have been a great coach or manager.
Right.
And he could have been a coach. He could have gone and been a hitting coach somewhere, but he obviously didn't get that opportunity either. So does that mean that, when he signed with the Boston Braves towards the end of his career, did they kind of sign him with the intention that you're going to come on and be our de facto hitting coach? That happened with Greg Maddux at the end of his career. The Padres and the Dodgers signed him when he was not a great pitcher anymore, but he was still Greg Maddux. So they were like, you're going to basically be a pitching coach, right? And he's like, no, you want to hire me as a pitching coach, hire me as a pitching coach. But if I'm going to pitch, that's not my job.
Right.
Is that kind of what happened with Babe Ruth, where they were giving him an interview and a shot at being a coach without actually calling it that, and he just wasn't good at it or didn't like doing it or didn't want to do it? And every other team was like, okay, well then we're not going to hire you in that same position.
But wouldn't you think he kind of would have had the word out that he'd be very interested in listening to offers?
Yeah.
He had Christie still with him.
But if he wasn't good at that...
you mean during his trial period with...
Right. Those who can't do teach, right? That's the saying. But just because you can do doesn't mean you can teach.
Right.
So maybe that's part of the story too, is that he kind of did have a shot and just wasn't good at it.
Now here is where we're going to talk about Kennesaw Mountain Landis. Another whole aspect of him, of being a racist and not wanting the color barrier broken on his watch.
There's a difference between being a hitting coach and being a manager.
Right,
when you're just a hitting coach, you don't have the authority to be like, you know what, I'm bringing in Josh Gibson to play on my team, or I'm bringing in Satchel Paige, or So if you don't have that authority to make those personnel decisions, then it's kind of a moot point that, you were never offered a managerial position, and maybe he wasn't offered that position because he wasn't a good secondary coach, That's all speculation. I don't know if that's what even happened, but that's something to consider.
It's a possibility.
Yeah.
I know that there's often been speculation about whether Babe Ruth was black or not. Not that it matters. It kind of would be perfect injustice to Kennesaw Mountain Landis if he was. But again, going to photographs that I have of my German great-grandparents and seeing them in their youth, he looks just like they did. The same facial characteristics, everything else. And it was like, no, knowing what I do because of my personal ancestry, there's not a question. And obviously, as Shawn said, they have his whole family tree and all that.
There's a story that I heard in Cleveland a few years ago. I went on a road trip with my buddy Neil. He knows of a very old bar. I hope it's still open. It was when we were there, but who knows with coronavirus if they survived. But it opened in or around 1919. It's called Hotz Cafe, H-O-T-Z, and it was open through Prohibition. And it was like a couple blocks away from League Park, where the Indians and Naps played back then. And all of the players liked to go there after the game, especially opposing players who weren't from Cleveland, didn't have homes to go back to after the games, because they knew that the bar owner would accept payment by check, and he would never cash those checks because he wanted the signatures. So they have signed checks by Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig and all of these greats of baseball history. And so the players would go in and get drunk for free, and everybody was happy because they just drank for free all night, and the owner just had Babe Ruth in their bar and, now has a signed check by him.
So what you're saying is don't bother going to Cooperstown if you want to see these greats. Just hit up Hots in Cleveland.
Yeah. Those are the types of interesting stories that you don't hear most places.
Right.
That's something you've got to go experience in real life or hear from somebody who was there. And those are the great stories that make baseball so interesting, and not just baseball, but history in general.
It's all about being in the place, so you can see how far was it from League Park. And we were lucky enough to do this road trip, and Boston was one of our stops. And we go into a place and we see there's a back door to walk right across the street to Fenway. And it's like that's the way the players went. Right. And there's nothing you're going to read that's going to show you that
or make it matter.
Right.
If you did read that in a book, you'd go, so what?
Right.
But when you're there, it's like, oh, this is kind of cool. It's the player shortcut.
Right. In Shibe Park, Babe seemed to just shine even more greatly than he did anyplace else. And it was really cool to hear that because we had just been to Shibe Park's footprint.
Yeah.
And it just all makes it that much more real. Of course, I took Shawn's recommendation and bought Big Fella, Jane Levy's book, and it is a very comprehensive work on Babe. And during her intro, there's a story and a comment. The story is about Cal Ripken. They're in Cooperstown at the Hall of Fame for some event or whatever. And, so he's looking at the bats of Babe Ruth and this and that. But he knows that nearby there's a bowling alley where Babe Ruth used to bowl. And so he's like, he would really like to see the bowling balls of Babe Ruth. And she makes it happen somehow. And so the guy measures the distance between the finger holes on the bowling ball. And they're not extraordinary. They're further apart than you might imagine. But the thing that really comes out as, who was this guy with these monster hands, is the dimensions of the holes. At the first knuckle, it's 1.25 inches. And Cal Ripken, looks at his hands kind of like, holy cow. It just was a very physical way to see just how powerful his hands could be, whether it was hurling a ball at a batter or smashing the heck out of a pitch that comes to him right over the fence. I think there's a quote in here that captures really the essence of Babe Ruth, and it's a line from an obituary that was written when he passed away, and it was in the New York Herald Tribune. And they talk about him as being the complete American. They wrote, it wasn't that rags to riches mythology, but his restlessness and energy. Winking, swinging, mincing, sliding, he seemed always to be going somewhere, doing something, usually over the speed limit. So, that had my attention because that, I think, should be everybody's motto, to always be over the speed limit. But everything he just did
larger than life.
Larger than life. He was living life large. And you made a comment about sometimes people who have lost parents or maybe a sibling, someone that they're very close to at a young age, how then as they grow into adulthood, they have a come what may attitude because they think they're not going to have a long life. So they may as well grab the gusto while they can.
Or they've just spent their entire life thinking, I'm going to die at 51 also.
Right.
So
I'm going to grab the gusto and not worry about it. Live while I can. I thought that was an insightful look because you have it with Mickey Mantle, right? And, you just think about different figures in history where they've had some adversity in their lives at a young age, and it helps form the adult that they become and their philosophy on life.
Speaking of larger than life, all of Babe Ruth's nicknames, and Shawn brought up one that I wasn't super familiar with, the American Hercules.
That's a great one.
Great one. Colossus of Cloud. I mean, that whole scene in Sandlot where they're just going...
Exactly.
Oh, I thought you said Bambi. That wimpy deer? Like, there's 30 different nicknames.
Right.
And they're all incredible.
Right. You're trying to find the adjective that can capture this Herculean guy, and... you just keep trying and trying and trying, and sometimes they stuck and sometimes they don't. I like the way he became an American icon. And some of the other names that were thrown out during that part of the conversation were Marilyn Monroe, Elvis, maybe James Dean. But the name that didn't pop up during that conversation was Joe DiMaggio, who also at the time was an icon. But just the way he approached life and his whole demeanor, how he approached his former team, was so completely different than what Babe, even though Babe had disappointment in how he didn't have a managerial post afterwards or whatever. His image is still a very positive, going to do everything I can to help out other people, raise them up. That's not what you think of when you think of Joe DiMaggio.
I wonder what it was 40 years ago, though, because I think his image has been tarnished the more stories come out about him. And you hear people like Mickey Mantle towards the end of their life say, and everybody who was in the room knew anyways, that in the locker room, all the Mickey's teammates knew, yeah, you know, he and Joe don't really get along. But then you kind of hear him say why they don't get along. And you hear those stories about, oh, that's not just how Joe was with Mickey, it's kind of how he was with everybody. And kicking reporters out of the locker room because he refused to be photographed unless he was completely either in uniform or in his suit head to toe. And it's like, okay, well, for the public to see that image, yeah, you look great. You're always stunningly dressed and you're always, you know, Joe DiMaggio. You're Joltin' Joe.
Right.
But that was before the press felt comfortable saying, like, this guy's kind of a jerk.
I agree. And that's kind of my point, is that we know the behind the scenes privately displayed Joe. We know now a lot about Babe Ruth's private life, which had a lot of drama, things that were occurring during his life to people close and dear to him. But there's nothing I learned in the past 3 months talking about Babe Ruth that changes my image of him or my perception of him. If anything, I admire him even more because of what he persevered through and still maintained his positivity.
I think another difference between Babe Ruth and Joe DiMaggio specifically is that all these years later, Babe Ruth either still holds the records or is still top 10 or top 5 or whatever, where Joe DiMaggio, when he retired, I think he was 5th on the all-time home run list when he retired. And now he's not even top 50, I don't think. You know, he's just been so far surpassed. And yeah, he still has the longest hitting streak of all time, but his name doesn't come up enough.
Yeah.
You know, and he was immediately succeeded by Mickey Mantle. Nobody took Babe Ruth's spot. It's really easy to be an all-time great until the guy who comes after you is all-time greater. You know, 536 home runs and half of them hung over.
Yeah.
With a bum knee that your predecessor caused.
Don't let the door hit you on the way out.
Right. So it would be like if Cal Ripken Jr. retired with 2,632 straight games played, and then the next Baltimore Orioles shortstop played 3,000. It's like, that. Who's that Cal guy?
Yeah.
And Shawn even said, half the kids in the classrooms now barely know who Cal Ripken is. And he wasn't succeeded by somebody great.
Right.
So that just goes to show you how fickle people are about who they remember and who they continue to put on pedestals. And the fact that it's 100 years later and we're still calling Babe Ruth the Babe Ruth of baseball.
Right.
That is a testament to what he was.
Absolutely. The equation of him to the Roaring 20s, you know, he embodied the Roaring 20s in such a happy time after World War I and after the first pandemic that hit the United States. And people were so tired of the killing of war and the death of the pandemic that they were so ready to just let loose. And they did. And he was right there leading the charge. So it makes you kind of wonder who's going to be, when we get on the other side of this pandemic, watch out, who's going to be ready.
Come on, Mookie Betts. We need you.
I'm so glad I had the opportunity to be there and experience the museum. I loved being so close to Oriole Park at Camden Yards and seeing all the different statuary outside there. And who would have thought that there would be a Babe Ruth statue at the entrance? But one of the cool things that they have done is having the 60 baseballs along the sidewalk from the front of Camden Yards to the front of the Birthplace. So you just follow along those baseballs and you arrive at the doorstep of where Babe Ruth was born, where it all began. Genius.
Yeah, and just a really creative display. And there's 60 balls to commemorate his 60 home runs in 1927. So,
right.
Yeah, very cool. Okay. Thanks, Mom.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks for taking me with. And thank you, Shawn, for making it such a great day.
Yes, thanks, Shawn. Okay, so that's it. In the introduction of this episode, I mentioned a trivia question that you can answer to win something. And here's how you can do that. First, make sure you're following us on Twitter at Shoeless Podcast. Then, find the pinned tweet at the top of our profile with the link to the Shawn Herne episode, which asks this week's trivia question. The answer to the trivia question was somewhere in the episode you just finished listening to. Retweet that tweet along with your answer, and we'll announce the winner on Twitter later this month. You don't have to be first, you just have to be right. But make sure you're following us. We'll pick one person who answered correctly, and they'll win an enamel pin only available to members of the Shoeless Joe Jackson Museum, and a replica copy of a double-sided flipbook which originally came out in 1931, thanks to the help of Christy Walsh and A.G. Spalding and Brothers. It shows Babe Ruth's two different approaches at the plate. If you hold it in one direction and flip the pages, Babe is swinging for a home run. You can watch the incredible transfer of power in his stride, with his weight shifting from his back foot entirely to his front foot. Turn the book over, and you see Babe's second approach at the plate, trying to hit line drives, with much more balance throughout the duration of the swing. By the end of this swing, Babe is still standing straight up and down, with his back foot remaining firmly on the ground. This swing is the one he modeled more closely after Shoeless Joe Jackson, and with great success. Babe batted .342 for his career, which is something many people don't realize. Of course he was a great home run hitter, but he also batted for an incredibly high average. After taking it to the fourth decimal point, Babe's career average is good enough for 10th on the all-time list, just 7 spots and 14 points behind Shoeless Joe. But their swings weren't the only things Shoeless Joe and Babe Ruth had in common. On an afternoon off from playing ball July 7th, 1915, Joe and Katie Jackson went out for a car ride east of Cleveland when their car began acting up. Joe surrendered the wheel to his wife, and with the car still driving down the road, he climbed out onto the running board to listen to the engine. A passing wagon sideswiped the Jackson car and knocked Joe onto the ground. He was dragged 75 feet before the car could be stopped. No bones were broken, but Joe suffered an elbow injury that kept him out of the lineup for 3 weeks. I had my leg all tore up, my kneecap came out, and it looked like I would be through as a ball player, Joe said later. After a kind of tumultuous offseason the previous winter, and now with the car accident, Cleveland owner Charlie Summers decided it was time to trade Joe, which he did 25 days after Joe returned to the lineup. Thanks to an article by Frank Fitzpatrick of the Philadelphia Inquirer, we learned that Babe Ruth was also in a car accident during his playing career. And it also happened on July 7th, 5 years to the day after Joe had his. Babe was 25 years old and halfway through the 1920 season, his first as a Yankee. On the afternoon of July 6th, the Yankees routed the Washington Senators 17-0 in Washington. Babe had a pair of singles, picking up his 70th and 71st RBI through 75 games. The Yankees were off the following day, and as he sometimes did, Babe got permission from manager Miller Huggins to drive back to New York instead of taking the train with the team. We heard earlier in this episode how sometimes Babe's arm would hurt him after train rides. Anyway, sometime early that evening, Babe and 4 other people piled into his new $10,000 Packard. The 4 other people were Helen, his wife of 6 years, his teammates Frank Gleich and Fred Hoffman, and Yankees coach Charlie O'Leary. The previous winter, Babe had signed a 2-year contract for a total of $41,000. But with endorsements and other outside income, he would earn an estimated $60,000 in 1920. For reference, the average income in America in 1920 was less than $3,300. Now remember, this is 1920, so Prohibition, although in its infancy, is still very much a real thing happening in America at the time. Even though the bulk of his career took place during Prohibition, Babe never really had trouble finding beer and whiskey. That night, he and his party stopped in Baltimore for some illegal refreshments, and sometime after midnight, they headed north. With I-95 not yet existing, they traveled mostly on the rural US 1. It was a rainy night, and the well-lubricated Babe was apparently in a hurry, traveling at what state police would characterize later as a fair rate of speed. Near 3 a.m., the big Packard rounded the second of 2 sharp, hilly curves in Delaware County. The road there was rain-soaked and paved with bricks, and the car spun out of control. It flipped onto its roof, and without striking a tree or anything else, slid to a stop on the south side of the highway. Babe's left knee was cut badly, but he cleared himself, then helped his wife and friends. Charlie O'Leary, who had been asleep in the back seat, laid motionless. Babe thought he was dead. "Speak to me, Charlie," one biography quotes Ruth as saying. "Speak to me." "What the hell happened?" O'Leary said, opening his eyes. "And where's my hat?" After determining that, almost miraculously, no one was seriously hurt, they walked a few hundred yards west until they spotted a Revolutionary-era farmhouse in a stand of chestnut trees. It was the summer residence of Coates Coleman, a businessman who owned the news and tobacco shop in Philadelphia's suburban station. He answered the knock. The man at the door was disheveled, smelled of liquor, and was obviously disoriented. Coleman didn't know him and must have been wary. The morning's Philadelphia papers were filled with accounts of a Sharon Hill man shot to death by highwaymen not far north of there. "We've had an accident on the road, and I've got to get to New York," Babe told him, "for a baseball game." And with that, Coleman recognized his visitor. His wife awoke and began tending to the group's injuries. "They looked ready for the hospital," she told the Inquirer. Coleman's grandson said in 1997, "From what my grandfather told me, Ruth had half a snootful." State police were summoned to the accident scene, but their report disappeared long ago. A local garage was contacted to tow the damaged car. "Sell it if you want to," Ruth allegedly told an employee. "I'll get another one when I arrive in New York." Though he was badly limping, Ruth refused the offer of a ride to the train station, about a mile from the house. The group arrived shortly before dawn and caught the 5:34 a.m. train to Philadelphia, where Ruth called Miller Huggins. He let his manager know about the accident and assured him he'd be back and ready to play against Detroit the next afternoon. He made it, going 1 for 4 with an RBI in the second-place Yankees' 4-3 loss to the Tigers at the Polo Grounds, where the Yankees were still playing their home games. Just across the Harlem River, a new ballpark was rising, Yankee Stadium, the house that Ruth built. Had Babe's car skidded a little further or overturned somewhere else that night, it might have forever changed baseball and American culture. But it didn't, and now it's just a funny anecdote about one of the original members of baseball's Hall of Fame. Speaking of being a member, if you'd like to become a member of our museum, we'd be thrilled to have you. Just go to our website, shoelessjoejackson.org, and click the tab at the top that says Join. You can pick the annual membership that fits your current budget, and you'll get some cool stuff in return. It could range from items in our gift shop to a personally guided tour around Greenville where you can see all of the spots here in town that are important to Joe's life and career. Our museum is always free to enter, but your memberships, purchases, and donations allow us to continue to operate and to continue to serve our community, both in person and online. If you have questions about the Shoeless Joe Jackson Museum, about the podcast, or about anything else, you can reach out on social media or email me at shoelesspodcast@gmail.com, and I'll try to answer them in the next episode. If you want to send in a video or audio recording of your question so I can play it on the show, that's cool too. If you have ideas for guests you'd like us to talk to on the podcast, send us your list. And if you know current or former ball players, managers, broadcasters, journalists, or if you are one, let's talk. A lot of you have liked and subscribed to My Baseball History, and we're so thankful for that. Some of you have even rated and reviewed the show. It's a huge help when you guys rate and review the show on whatever platform you choose to listen to. 5-star ratings help our podcast get shown on more people's suggested podcast page, which means that more people will hear our show. It just takes a couple seconds of your time, but it really helps us a lot. And of course, liking us on social media, interacting with our posts, and sharing things with your friends is great too. No matter how you choose to support us, even if it's just by listening, we appreciate you being here. Until next time, I'm Dan Wallach, and this is My Baseball History.